So this seminar is going to be about Islamic finance in theory, in terms of how Islamic finance, or how finance and how Islam views finance and the concept of it. And we're going to look at the theory in terms of how it's supposed to work. And then we're going to look at the practice in terms of how it's generally working in the world. And then we'll discuss some criticisms to determine whether it is working or it's not working. So is it functioning the way it was supposed to function or not? So with that, let me introduce our speakers. So I'm the first speaker, and my bio is on our website. So if you care to read it, you can read it there. And then to my left here is Shaykh Umar Khan, and I'm going to introduce him because he's not that well known. So he is the, I missed one thing, but you're the Vice President of Technology, is that right? Or you different title now? Yeah, SpaceX. Yeah, I don't see how that's relevant. Yeah, I know. I just wanted to introduce that anyway. So Umar's the Vice President of Technology at SpaceX. He completed a formal alim program from As-Salam Institute in the UK, which is authorized by Darul Ulum Nadwatul Ulama, which is considered to be a alimiya program, like a scholar's program in Islamic studies. He has a master's in finance, and he has that's from the University of Pennsylvania, School of Wharton School of Business, and he has another master's in Islamic finance from the Islamic Finance Institute in London, and he has a few Islamic finance certifications. For example, he's a certified Islamic finance expert from the Islamic Finance Institute in London as well. So the reason why I introduced that, usually I don't give him any introduction at all, but the reason why I did that is because oftentimes when people are presenting on Islamic finance, one of the criticisms is that, these are just, some random person who maybe read the Quran, studied some hadith, studied some old classical fiqh books. They don't even understand how a modern economy works. They don't understand what modern finance is. And so I'm introducing that because, one, I've kind of done my own research in this field quite a bit. And number two, we have someone who has the credentials in the field as well, in the finance and in the Islamic finance field. So if someone comes along and says, well, you don't have the Islamic studies background knowledge, well, we both have it. Oh, we're both completing an IFTA program as well to become certified muftis as well. And we're skipping class today, right now actually, to teach this class, but we have permission from our teacher. So the Islamic knowledge is, there. Of course, it's relative. The Islamic, someone will claim, well, you don't understand finance. So the finance part is there. And someone will say, well, you don't understand how Islamic finance really works. So the Islamic finance part is there too. So I just wanted to clarify that at the get-go, so people don't, just assume that we have absolutely no idea what we're talking about. We have no idea where we're coming from. But at the same time, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to simplify concepts as much as possible. So our target audience is kind of like middle range. So we're not going to be speaking very high-level finance language or even Islamic economics language or Sharia language, nor are we going to dumb it down too much for the average person. So our goal is kind of like mid-range. So the average kind of fairly educated person who has some interest in economics and finance will be able to understand these things. So with that intro, the second recommendation that I have for a lot of people is we put a pen and a paper in front of you for a reason. Number one, the pen helps advertise our university. But that's not the main reason. The main reason is that there's actually solid research which shows that if you take notes on a laptop or if you take notes on your phone, you are less likely to understand that information than if you were actually writing by hand. And we're not going to get into the details of why that is. So my suggestion is, if you really want to focus, this is a little bit of a heavy topic, and you want to take some notes, try to mute your phone and just stay away from your phone. Because if you get distracted, what's going to end up happening, you're going to be like taking notes, you're going to be listening, like this is interesting, and then your friend messages you and like, where should we go for lunch? And you're like, yeah, just a real quick message, just let me just respond real quick, and you'll miss a very important point, and you'll think that, you know what, that wasn't covered in the seminar. But you won't realize it's because you got distracted. So many people make that mistake. So my suggestion is, if you don't need your phone, unless you're on call for some emergency, just put it away completely, okay? So that's point number one. Point number two is completely contradictory to what I just told you, and that is that we are using an app called Slido to actually ask questions. So what you can do is you can download this app called Slido, S-L-I-D-O, and what it does is basically you can type your questions in here, and you can upvote the questions that you like and downvote the questions that you don't like. I don't know if you can downvote, but you can upvote at least the questions that you think are relevant. And what we'll do is during Q&A time, we're going to take one question from Slido and one question from the live audience. So you can do that. So my suggestion is, instead of typing in Slido, while you're taking notes and while we're presenting, and instead of reading the questions through, just write down the questions you have on the paper, and then during the break time, you can transfer them into Slido, and then you can vote them up and all that stuff. So that's going to work pretty well. Okay. The restrooms are to my left through this door over here for both men and women. We're going to have 2 breaks. Usually we have one 20-minute break. This session we're going to have 2 15-minute breaks because this topic is a little bit heavier and people just tend to start, zooming out, and stuff. Zoning out. Right? See, I'm already zoning out. So she'll start zoning out, right? So if we see that happening, we're just going to be like, you know what? It looks like we lost a few people. If we see some heads fall on the table or something like that, then we know it's going to be time for a break, and we'll give you that break, inshallah. Any other matters we need to cover? Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Hold it 2 seconds.
Assalamu alaikum. Okay, that's better. So a bit of, can you hear me okay? Okay, so just wanted to maybe explain what we will cover, which topics we will cover in this seminar, and which topics we will not cover. So what happens is basically for the average person, the average Muslim, we assume that anything that has to do with money is Islamic finance. So whether we're talking about personal investments, whether we're talking about the macroeconomy, whether we're talking about mortgages, bank accounts, whether we're talking about zakah, whether we're talking about inheritance. So there's a variety of different topics, gifts, and so on. So in the topic of Islamic studies, Islamic finance is narrower than that. So for example, if you think inheritance is a part of finance, right, which it may be considered in conventional finance, it actually is not in the topic of Islamic studies. We've got an inheritance expert sitting back there. So, Ahmed Shaykh joined us. If you have questions on inheritance, you can certainly go to him. He knows all about wills, estate planning, everything like that. So that's a topic we will not be going into. We will also not be covering the topic of charity and zakah. So zakah and sadaqah are outside of the scope of the conversation. So if you have questions about how do I take care of zakah on my bank account or my stocks or my 401k, we're happy to answer those questions outside of the seminar. Or maybe just since Ramadan is coming up, generally before Ramadan, the number of zakah workshops pick up. So inshallah, that is a good place to ask your questions about zakah. So those are some of the things that we're not covering. So what are we covering? Primarily, we want to start by covering the topic of riba. Riba is usually translated as interest. So maybe that's the topic we'll be discussing. And we're going to spend a good chunk of time talking about this topic of riba, because this is one of the most misunderstood and maybe somewhat controversial topics in Islamic finance. And so people are always trying to understand, why is interest prohibited in Islam? So we want to clarify that point by talking a little bit about the history, talking a little bit about the prohibition in Quran and Sunnah, and then explaining in simple ways that maybe we can all understand why riba itself is prohibited. So a good chunk of today, we'll be talking about riba itself. And then if we get time today, inshallah, we'll talk a little bit more about what a halal business is, what types of transactions are permitted, what types of transactions are not permitted. and we'll probably end the day over there. Next weekend, inshallah, we'll start getting into the meat of Islamic finance. So today is about riba, what's like not allowed. Next weekend, we'll get into more what is allowed and how partnerships are formed, how stocks work, how bonds work, real estate, and so on. So that will be a little bit more maybe a little bit more practical, but today helps you understand the why. Now, this seminar is also not about how you should invest. So which stocks you should buy, which ones are the good ones to buy, you know, is it Tesla, is it Apple, you know, should you invest in Amazon or not? That's not going to be covered. We're not going to talk about 401k versus Roth IRAs and all these different things. We won't talk about portfolio diversification. Maybe that's a separate seminar we can do on how to invest, right? But that's not this seminar. This is a bit more academic, talking about Islamic finance so people can understand. Also, Islamic finance is a very dry subject. So we're going to try and make it a little bit more interesting, but it can be very, very dry. So we'll try and make it as simple and presentable and interesting as possible, inshallah.
Okay. What was that? Oh,
Like finance, okay. The comment from the audience was,
not monotone.
we're not monotone. Yeah, we will try not to be monotone. I think both of us have not after last week, so we'll see, but inshallah, we're going to try and make it as interesting. Also, in terms of Q&A, just want to, if there's something you don't understand, if we happen to use a term, there's a lot of terminology and we're trying to remove much of the terminology. If there's something that you do not understand, please ask the question right away. If we use a term, we say like debt versus equity, and you go, I'm sorry, I don't know what that means. Okay, we'll explain it. We'll just take a sidebar, 1 minute, we'll explain it, because if you don't understand the basic terms, you will be lost after 2 hours, and you will definitely be lost the next weekend. So please don't get lost. Ask the question. Don't be shy, and ask the question. If the question is about something that builds on the topic, like, hey, you just talked about musharaka, how about stocks? Leave that for the Q&A session, okay? So questions that build upon, leave those for the Q&A session, but questions of not understanding, ask those during the session. Because as our scholars have said, if you are not asking questions, it's either because you are too proud, right? You're too proud and arrogant. You don't want to seem like you don't understand something, so you want to kind of look good in front of people, and that's not a good reason. Or you just maybe don't care enough, or you're not interested in the knowledge. So let's make sure you're asking the questions. If you don't understand something, please ask the question.
Okay, so for the Slido, I forgot to mention the join code. So the join code is 1086. Okay, 1086. All right. So with that, we'll get started. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah, wa ba'd. So Islamic finance. So finance refers to money matters, basically. And the first thing we're going to talk about is riba. This word riba, we have to really understand what it means, because this is the term that was used in Islam. But there's many different terms that have been used throughout history. Terms like usury, terms like interest, and there's different words that are used for the concept that we're going to be discussing. So technically, what is interest understood as? Can anyone give me a bare bones definition of what they think interest is? Yes. Making money off of money. Okay. Anyone else? Okay. Yes. Making money off of money with a time element to it. Okay. Very good. We'll leave it at those two. Okay. We're gonna come back to this concept. And what is usury then? Anything over 15%. 15, 1 5? 1 5. Okay, 15. All right. I'll challenge you on that later. But yes, that's good. So he mentioned a good point. So basically what usury is today is it's any interest rate that is above the maximum that's defined by law. You say defined by law where? Right. Well, in America, every state has its own laws for what's considered to be usury. So in America, you have a ton of different standards. Canada has a different standard. Different countries will have different standards. So that's what usury and interest is kind of today, and we're going to go back and reanalyze these terms. But what we want to do is we want to go back in time and we want to look and say, well, this idea of making money off of money, whether it's due to time or whether it's not due to time, where did that start? How far back can we actually trace it? So if we go back in ancient societies, what we find is, according to historians, there was this concept of food money, where food was actually food like olives, dates, seeds, even animals. People used to loan them out as early as 5000 BCE, right? If not earlier. So the ancient Mesopotamian people did it. The ancient Hittites did that. The Phoenicians, the ancient Egyptians. All of those societies, we have evidence that shows that they used to give out loans to other people, and when they would ask for whatever it is that they gave, when they asked for it back, they wanted some increase on that. So this is what we find in ancient societies, but we don't have too many details about that. And then we fast forward a little bit, and we get to Greek society. So what was going on? Actually, well, stick with ancient societies. Hindu society, going way back, ancient India. We have religious manuscripts in ancient India between the years 2000 and 1400 BCE, which talk about usury or talk about the concept of interest, and they equate the terms usury and interest. I mean, they don't use two different terms, but they talk about any amount over and above the principal is considered to be in the category of interest. And what did it actually say about it? It says that it is disdained. It says that it is frowned upon. So you find that in the Hindu Sutra, for example, which was written between 700 and 100 BC. They talked about the payment of interest. People who pay interest, they're looked down upon. Something is wrong with charging interest and the people who are taking those loans. In ancient Buddhist society, you have the Buddhist Jatkas between 600 and 400 BCE. They talk about disdain for payment of interest as well, or even taking of interest. So you have many ancient societies are engaging in the practice. The practice exists in their society, and you have, at least so far, ancient Hinduism, ancient Buddhism at this time, frowning and looking down upon the practice and saying the idea of loaning, whether it's money or whether it's food money in a different form, and you're asking for a greater return when it's coming back, that is considered to be something bad, right? Then we go to Greek society. Now the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, you have philosophers, very famous ones like Plato, Aristotle. What other Greek philosophers can you name? Socrates, he's the third famous one. Can you name any others besides the three? It's okay if you can't. Right, it's okay. So we got three, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. So Plato, huh? Who? Oh, Ptolemy, yes, Ptolemy. So what you have is you have Plato and Aristotle being the two of the most famous. They actually criticized the idea of usury or interest. So they looked down upon it, and the group of philosophers known as the scholastics, they made this argument, and the argument has been preserved, especially the Aristotelian Aristotle's argument has been preserved. He basically says that asking for an amount over and above the principal when you give a loan is considered to be an unjust claim. Why is it an unjust claim? Because you're asking for compensation for something which you did not put any effort into and you did not actually make any sacrifice for. And he's saying that why is it not considered to be a valid sacrifice? He says that money by its nature is considered to be sterile, right? And without going into the concept of that. And he says there's no loss if you're temporarily separated from your money. So on what basis, what did you actually achieve when you gave that money? What effort did you put in? What risk did you really take? A recognized risk. So Aristotle understood that, and he made that argument. So among the Greeks, the concept of usury, I'll just use usury and interest simultaneously right now, it was looked down upon. It was frowned upon in any amount. Okay, that's among the Greeks. Then we go among the Romans. You have very famous Roman thinkers like Cato, Cicero, Seneca, and Plutarch. they all criticized usury as well. They looked down upon it and they said it's a problem. Cato was one of those people. In one of his texts, he was asked, say, what do you think about lending money and asking for usury back? So his response was, what do you think about murder? Like, that was his response. Like, it's as bad as murder. That's how, and look, these are not religious people. These are not Jews. These are not Christians. These are pagan people who pride themselves on utilizing their mind to understand what makes sense and what's best for society. And they're arriving at a very early period and saying, this is one of the worst things, when you're asking me about usury, or when you ask me about murder, what do I think about murder? It's that bad. And then what happened was, we have data that shows there were some legal reforms known as the Lex Genusia in the Roman Republic in about 340 BCE, where they actually banned interest completely in all shape, in any amount. All right, small amounts, large amounts, interest was completely banned in Roman society, right, BCE. But what ends up happening is, later on in the late Roman period of the Roman Empire, and keep in mind, late periods are usually periods of decline. So even though they're powerful, still a period of decline, so you can kind of see the connection here, that interest became something very common in the Roman Empire. So the whole shift took place. So it became so common that you find leaders like Julius Caesar coming and stipulating a maximum amount. So they said, you know what, interest rates need to be regulated. So Julius Caesar regulated at 12%. When Justinian was the emperor, he regulated at some rate between 4 to 8%, depending on what class you're coming from, and a little bit higher if you're depending on the type of investment you're getting involved in. And it got to a point where they actually had high interest rates as well, between 24 to 48%. So who would take an interest loan at 24 to 48% if it's being capped by the government at this point? It was very short-term loans taken by very wealthy people. If they thought the profit looked good, they would take an amount. They would take a huge risk on it because they knew they could lose the money. It's not a big deal. Or they could make a ton of money, and they would go ahead and take those loans. So generally, in the Roman period, interest was actually banned, but then later on, near the end, it became commonplace. In Judaism now, so what we find is, Judaism, the term for interest or usury in Hebrew is ribit, which is very similar to riba in the Arabic. Now, it's mentioned in the version of the Torah that we have with us today, right, in the Old Testament, in the verses of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, verses 20 to 21, it says, thou shalt not lend upon interest to thy brother. Okay, you cannot loan any type of money to your brother with interest. Interest of money, interest of victuals, interest of anything that is lent upon interest. Any type of interest, you cannot give it to your brother. This is being given to the Jewish people. And then they say, but to a foreigner, you can lend on interest. So there was one exception. And the exception is, for foreigners, you're allowed to give it on interest. So what does a foreigner mean? A foreigner means a non-Jew. So why? We're going to talk about that in a moment, right? So that's the one clear-cut verse. Now, there's a bunch of other verses here. Exodus, Leviticus, Ezekiel, Nehemiah, Psalms, Proverbs. So many verses talking about interest being prohibited. You're not allowed to loan at any rate of interest at all, with the one exception, and that's to non-Jews. So some people have come along, and when they were trying to modernize Judaism and kind of reinterpret scripture, they said, well, the verse on Exodus, it was talking about loaning money to poor people and charging them interest, or loaning money to sick people. And the verse in Leviticus was the same way as well, right? But nobody could make the argument that Deuteronomy was talking about anything but that. So even if someone makes that argument, the argument is, responded to, is counteracted. The second argument that has been made is they said, well, why was it allowed for Jews to loan money on interest to non-Jews? Say, well, we need an explanation because that looks bad. So the explanation was, they said, well, it's not just that they're non-Jews, but since Jews form a community, non-Jews are foreigners. They're coming from the outside. And because they're coming from the outside, they're technically can be seen as an enemy because they may be trying to attack us or something like that. So therefore, foreigners are seen to be an enemy, and we're allowed to charge interest to an enemy because interest is a weapon to submit other people into surrendering, and it's a way to destroy people, basically. So what you find is even the most charitable understanding of the exception of why Jews can charge interest to non-Jews explains the wisdom behind why it's prohibited in the first place. Because what interest does to people, it actually it starts to destroy them as if you're attacking your enemy. Okay, so it becomes a problem. Let's move on to Christianity. The Catholic Church, which used to define most of Christianity, there's different forms of Christianity, but the Catholic Church basically had a doctrine that says any type of interest is sinful. Any amount, doesn't matter what it is. So the Council of Nicaea, which happened in the year 325, which is where the Gospels, 4 Gospels in the New Testament today, they were kind of decided upon. These are the Gospels we want. Constantine, Roman Empire, had converted to Christianity in 313, and now they come together, 325. They're coming together, they're deciding which books are going to be considered to be our Bible. So they're deciding what is the Bible. In the exact same council that they're deciding what the Bible is for the, for the last time, in historical Christianity, they made a clause in there, and they said, you know what, there's a lot of our clergy, they didn't say some, they said, there's a lot of our clergy in the church, they're taking interest. And they're like, this is clearly prohibited in the scripture. How can they be taking interest? So say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to pass a new law in the same council. If we catch any one of these priests or, any, fathers or church fathers or archbishops or whatever they are, if they're caught, we will expel them and they will now no longer be able to be clergy. So the prohibition was extremely clear for Christians prior to this, and they realized that some people were violating this, so they even documented and said we need to punish these people. Fast forwarding to the Middle Ages, right? So some people say, oh, early church didn't believe that, and then the later church, here's an argument that people make. They say in the medieval times, they became very anti-Jew. And I think they were equal opportunity anti-Jew, throughout the history. That's kind of my reading of it. But so they say they became anti-Jew, so they wanted to start penalizing, and they started becoming more strict in the understanding of interest. But you find that in the Council of Nicaea in 325, it's documented there, and it's not only a restriction for clergy. As some historians, I don't know, I was going through this, I don't know where they got this idea, but what they've done is they've tried to reread the history of Christianity to kind of interpret it to how it suits them. But if you look closely, you'll see that's not the case. Anyways, fast forwarding to the Middle Ages. So 1179, the Pope or the church issued a doctrine. They said anyone who takes any amount of interest is excommunicated from the church. You are not a Christian anymore. So not only is it a sin, you are not a Christian, and when you die, we will not bury you as a Christian. You won't even get to be inside the Christian graveyard for taking a little bit of interest, even if it's a small amount. So they're taking a very strong stance on it. And at the same time, there's Jews living in that area. So the Jews are doing what? They're the ones who are giving loans. They're, according to their religion, they're allowed to give loans to non-Jews, but they can't give loans to themselves with interest. So they're practicing it on the Christians. So now it's becoming a big issue. So in 1290, in England, for example, the whole area of England, the whole country, before countries were there, the whole region of England, they expelled and kicked out all of the Jews because they were charging usury. That was the at least the reasoning that they gave. So everyone was gone. And I remember, when I was visiting, I was doing a tour of Oxford University, like one of those open bus tours, and we're kind of going through, and they're showing me the different buildings and stuff like that. And like, oh, this is where penicillin was invented, in the World War, and this is where this thing was invented. Oh, this is really interesting. And they're like, yeah, and this is where the Jewish quarters where they used to live prior to their expulsion. And I was just like, Well, wait a minute. What do you mean prior to the expulsion? Yes, so, around this time, every single Jew in the entire country was kicked out of England, and all the Jews who were enrolled at Oxford University were all kicked out. Every single Jew was just expelled completely. And the reason was very clear, because their group is giving loans with interest or with usury, right? So this is something very clear in history that happened. So you can see the church's position and the university's position as well at the time was clear. So what you have is, you have a lot of famous instances in Christian history that talk about this. So Dante wrote a book. Anyone know what Dante's famous book is? Probably read it in English class or something. Inferno? Yeah, the Divine Comedy, right, referring to the Inferno. So he has these categories of who's going to hell and who's not going to hell. Where did he put people who deal in interest? Which area? The 7th level, the lowest level of hell, right? The absolute worst level of hell. And you have Shakespeare. He wrote a very famous book called The Merchant of Venice. Did anyone read The Merchant of Venice? One person. Two people. Okay, 2 people read them. It's funny. Okay, so we have 2 people who probably didn't read it in this country. Did you read it in Pakistan? Yeah, so the 2 people read it in Pakistan. Not a single person in America, actually. That's kind of interesting. But anyways, Umar being the exception. You were in Bangkok. Okay, so no one in America has read Shakespeare's works here. So the Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet, right? Yeah, because they made movies out of it. All right, anyways. So Shakespeare wrote Merchant of Venice, and the whole story, you probably heard of at least the title of the book. It's pretty famous. The whole story is about a Catholic guy by the name of Antonio. He's taking a loan from a guy named Shylock. And Shylock is a Jew. And the Jew is charging him interest. And the whole thing is about how he's charging him interest and what effect it's having and all of that stuff, right? That's what the entire story is about. So what you find is, this becomes a huge theme in Christianity. It's not like Christians didn't know this was happening, right? Christians don't remember their history, but it's very, very clear at this point in time, this is their history. Then St. Thomas Aquinas comes, and he's considered to be like the rational thinker, trying to bring Aristotelian thought in line with Christianity and thinking. So he comes along and tries to explain why does the church prohibit interest, and why does the Bible prohibit interest? So he comes along and he says, well, here's the more detailed reasoning. He says money is a measure of value, or money is a medium of exchange. It's going to be one of these 2 things. He says interest, when you charge interest on a loan, it's going to violate the essence of the purpose of money in the first place. So he gives an example. He says it's like double charging somebody when you're selling something. So he gives an example. He goes, if I sell you a bottle of wine, it's yours now. And then I say, but if you want to drink it, I'm going to charge you again if you want to drink it, right? So it's like, imagine, you can't have your cake and eat it too. That statement never made sense to me. But now, this is what he's saying. He's basically, if I sell you a piece of cake, right? It's yours now, I got my money. And then you're like, I'm going to eat the cake. You go, no, you can't eat the cake. You want to eat it? Or you have to pay me another amount on top of that. So he's saying that's what doing interest is like. So he gives that one example. And he's saying, why? Because time is not a commodity. And if time is not a commodity, it cannot be sold, and therefore something is wrong with this principle. And then he quotes Aristotle. And Aristotle comes back, and Aristotle was saying that if you live by usury, it's exceedingly unnatural because you're never going to be putting any effort or any risk in there, and you're going to constantly just keep on multiplying your money over and over again. So we're going to see this argument revisited. So Thomas Aquinas popularizes this. In 1745, getting to the modern period, right, Pope Benedict XIV comes along and issues an encyclical and condemns interest as usury. And he's saying, you know what? In our society now, 1745, people are starting to make this argument that there's a difference between interest and usury. One of them is a high amount, one of them is a low amount. And he goes, no. We need to clarify this point. So he says this statement. He says, one cannot condone the sin of usury by arguing that the gain is not great or excessive, but rather it's moderate or small. He's saying you can't justify it by saying, it's one of them is large and one of them is small. And he says, number two, neither can it be condoned by arguing that the borrower is rich. He said, well, if someone is borrowing money and they're rich, so it's okay to charge them interest because they're rich. He goes, you can't make that argument. It's invalid. Number three, nor by arguing that the money borrowed is not left idle, but it's being used in some capacity, right? He's saying these arguments don't fly. So while the church is saying this in one hand, at the same time, some workarounds are happening in the back end. So, for example, in, I think it was the 1600s, the Medici Bank actually started loaning money to the Vatican. And the Vatican is the Catholic Church, okay? So the Vatican is borrowing money from a bank, known as the Medici Bank, but because they needed money. So the Vatican says, but we can't accept interest. We can't pay you with interest, right? We need this money, but when we pay you back, we can't pay you back with interest because that's completely against our religion. So somebody came up with the idea. I don't know if it was the bank or if it was the theologians working in the, in the Vatican. They said, okay, here's what we're going to do. The bank also goes and sells silk, brocade, jewels, all these other commodities to the church, because church was a very, luxurious institution, right? I think like it still probably is today. So they're selling all this stuff. So they say, what we're going to do is we're going to overcharge you on the stuff that we're actually selling to you, and then you're going to take the loan and you're going to pay us back the loan, so we end up getting extra money at the same time. So we're going to take two transactions, which are separate, we're going to combine them into one, and that way you can go ahead and get your loan, and we're going to be happy we made our money. So they did that, right? So this starts becoming a common practice in the church. So when Martin Luther, okay, not Martin Luther King Jr., okay, I just want to clarify. Martin Luther goes and starts revolting or rebelling against the Catholic Church and gets his Protestant revolution started. One of the things he argues is the people in the church, they're saying interest is prohibited. They're saying you're not allowed to charge any interest, but what are they doing? They're just doing these workarounds, and they're taking interest in a different way. So he writes this in one of his speeches. He says, I'm doing this because of the accursed and damned Zinskauf. Zinskauf is a workaround, like stratagem, what we call in Arabic a hila, which the Pope has instituted. So they came up with this idea, you have a right to use a piece of land, it's going to be sold for fixed payments over a period of time, and you end up getting interest. So while the church is saying this, they have this concept of workarounds that are going on, okay, at the same time. So that has been Christianity, or at least Catholicism. But even Christianity during the Protestant Reformation, the founder, the father, Martin Luther, is critiquing the church and saying, how can you guys be taking interest, right? So even him, he's not overthrowing this concept of interest at the time. Then we have usury coming into the modern era, okay? So modern era coming in with the Renaissance, and then eventually the Enlightenment. So around the 1500s, this is where things start to change. European society begins changing, and arguments for interest start to surface. People start saying, we should have interest. Interest should be allowed. Doesn't matter what Scripture says. We'll worry about what Scripture says later on. Interest should be allowed, and they start making arguments for it. So we have Aristotle, you have St. Thomas Aquinas. They're making all these rational arguments against it, why it was prohibited. Now they're saying, well, we need to rethink this whole thing. Let's start making arguments of why it's a good thing to start charging people interest. So they start coming up with these different ideas. They say, well, you need to have a premium. There's a risk of default when you loan money. The person may not be able to pay you back. So what's going to happen? Whenever you loan money to someone, and you can't charge any interest, maybe they're not going to be able to pay you back. So there's got to be some premium that you can charge that person. You can get something out of it. Otherwise, you don't want to give a loan to that person. So that's one argument they come up with. Second argument is they say, no, that interest is a premium. Premium means like an additional payment, additional amount. It's a premium for the preference of having something now rather than having something later, right? So it's like, look, when you order something from I don't know, a tailor, or you order some custom-made item, right? Sometimes they have two prices. They go, do you want the You want it to be rushed? Should we finish? We could get it done in 24 hours. Let's say a flyer, right? Like if you saw the flyer for this seminar, you probably can tell that we should have hired a graphic designer instead of me doing it myself, right? So, but if you hire a graphic designer, what happens? They have two prices, right? They have one price. Oh, turnaround time is 2 weeks. Oh, if you want rush delivery, oh, I could do it within 72 hours, but it's an additional $15. So they're making the same argument. They go, well, when you're buying stuff, right, you can ask someone that if you want it faster, you're going to be paying them more money. So you're paying a premium, an extra amount of money for that rush expedited service. So they're saying, well, interest is something similar, right? Because if you want this money, you can have this money now, or you could have this money later, right? Because you can take time to earn it. So the fact that you're getting this money now and you're getting it earlier, it's going to cost you a premium, because there's a difference between getting something earlier and getting something later, just like we do in trade and economics. So they make this argument. So that's argument number 2. Argument number 3 they start making, they say, well, there's a lost opportunity cost, right? So if this money that I could have used this money in some way which would have benefited me. So this $100 which you're asking me to borrow to you, I could have gone and, I could have bought something with it. I missed that. Or I could have gone and invested it somewhere else and maybe I can make $1 return on it, right? So now the fact that I've given it to you, I've lost that opportunity. So who's gonna compensate me for my lost opportunity cost there? So that's argument number 3. And the argument number 4 is that, well, there's a price of deferred consumption, right? So which is basically, look, you want me to give $100 to you? I want to buy a gift for myself, right? It's like, if I give the money to you, I can't go and use the money myself. So because I lost that money and I gave it to you, there should be some compensation for me. So they start making all of these arguments, right? Starts coming in the 1500s. So it starts to become very prevalent. So they said, okay, in 1545, King Henry VIII of England did 2 very important decisions, okay? One of them, he wanted two things to take place, right? Because keep in mind, he's under the Pope. The kings are still subservient to the Pope. The Pope defines what the religion is. So King Henry VIII of England wants to do 2 things. Number 1, he wanted to marry another woman, and he didn't like his wife, so he wanted to divorce her. But guess what? Divorce is not allowed in Catholicism. So he goes to the Pope and says, look, you know what? I'm in love with this other girl, and I really don't like this wife. Can you please, just make an exception just for me, because I'm King Henry VIII. You can make one exception just for me. And the Pope goes, no exception. No exception for anybody, not even you. So King Henry becomes very upset. This is one story of why he split. So he goes, is very upset, and he goes, okay, fine, forget it. I'm going to start my own church. So the Church of England began, because he wanted to divorce his wife. So he divorced his wife and he married another woman. He said, forget the Pope. I don't need the Pope's authority. So that's one thing that happened. Second thing that happened is that he comes along and says, okay, we're going to fix a maximum interest rate in society, and we're going to differentiate between the term interest and usury. And once we define what the maximum interest rate is, anything above that is usury. It's haram. It's impermissible in the religion. Anything that's below that, that's okay. So we're going to draw a different line. So he comes up with this new concept. 1545 is when it happened. So now, prior to this, there's no difference between interest and usury. Now there's a difference in England between interest and usury. So other European nations now going through this modernization era, they're going through Renaissance, they're redefining themselves, and most of them start following the exact same example, just like England, and they start to say, yeah, we need to set an interest rate, we need to introduce these rates, and we need to say anything above it is usury, and anything below it is interest. They're 2 separate concepts. One of them is prohibited, according to our religion, so they're redefining the religion, and one of them is not prohibited. So then now we start to get a bunch of people explaining and making arguments for interest. So the Englishman Jeremy Bentham, he writes his book Defense of Usury in 1787, which were like letters given to Adam Smith, who is the father of capitalism. Adam Smith is economics. He's a very influential figure. So that book, it's said that really just changed the world because it changed the way that the economy is operating, right? And then you fast forward to the modern era, okay? 1917. The church, the Catholic Church, comes back and sees all of this happening and this Protestant Reformation and all these countries are modernizing and everything. So 1917, the Catholic Church comes back and goes, you know what? Well, we're getting behind now because this whole economic system has changed. So we need to start catching up as well. So the Code of Canon Law, they said, you know what? Okay, the churches that have extra money, we're going to allow them to accrue interest because otherwise our money is just devaluing. We need to at least allow somehow that we could get some interest as well. Said, okay, still no loaning, but the money that the church has, well, technically that's how you're going to make money, but only if the church has it. Christians cannot do it on an individual level, but the church itself, to protect itself, we're going to be allowed to accrue interest. So they kind of join the bandwagon here. So now we have this separation between interest and usury. And that comes back to the beginning point that I was talking with someone. They said 15% is the maximum or something like that. So it's not the case actually. So the case is, what is now the difference between interest and usury in the world today? Let's just take Canada, right? Canada, what is the rate? Does anyone know approximately? What is the usury rate? 60%. So anything at 60% above it is considered usury. You're not allowed. 60. 60. Okay? 60%. 60. Now, coming to America, every state has its own laws. Every state is allowed to define whatever they want. You say, well, that's great. What does California say? What do we say in California? California says 7 to 10%. Anything above, depending on what type of transaction it is, anything above 7% could potentially be usury and illegal in the state of California. Now you look at that and you're like, wow, that's pretty small. I mean, that's a really low threshold. How does that happen, right? And when you come across something like that, you say, wait a minute, but there are credit card companies and there's so many other companies that are charging much higher than that. How does that work? So, well, that's because of a Supreme Court decision that was passed, which basically says that as long as the financial institution is not based in that state, they can use the laws of another state to loan to anybody in the entire world as long as they're in a different state. And guess what? The best state to be in? It's Nevada, Delaware, and South Dakota. That's why if you've ever received your credit card statement, it's always going to come from Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Every single one. I don't have any of you seen anything besides that? You're going to see it pretty much there. Why? Because South Dakota is supposed to be a little bit of a conservative state, right? They realize, hey, we're losing jobs. We need to attract people to our economy. What should we do? Well, this is a great opportunity. What we can do is, let's try and get people to move to South Dakota and open up some jobs by saying, we're not going to have any usury rates at all. There's nothing. You could charge as much interest as you want. You can charge 1,000,000% interest, right? And we're not going to give you any problem at all. So how about you guys all start moving there? And all the banks, when they heard that, South Dakota made the declaration, they all started moving to South Dakota. So they're all headquartered in South Dakota, right? Or Nevada or Delaware. Perfect place to be. So there was even a credit card company or a bank, First Premier Bank, they were offering a credit card in America. The interest rate was 79.9% interest. Now, I don't know what in the world they were offering as an incentive to sign up for that card. I don't know. They must have had like some kind of, I don't know, toaster or some kind of caviar or something, right? But for some reason, that was the highest credit card interest rate in the United States of America. So practically, the way it works is there's these usury laws, but the usury laws don't really mean anything because of the way in which they function. So you could technically charge almost whatever you want today. So that's the concept of usury in the modern era from Christianity to post-Christianity. Now let's come to Islam. What does Islam say about interest, about usury, about all of that stuff? Well, we go to, whenever we want to learn something about Islam, we go to the Quran and we go to the Sunnah. The Sunnah meaning the hadith, the statements and teachings of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So let's look at the verses about riba. There's three main ones, okay? The first one, it says, "O you who believe, do not consume interest." The word riba is there. Do not consume interest multiplied and remultiplied. Okay? So let's focus on this verse for a moment. What is the context? When was this verse revealed? It was revealed around the time of the Battle of Uhud. Now, to give you some context, the Quran was revealed over a period of 23 years. The first 13 years were spent in Mecca, and the next 10 years were spent in Medina. Now, the Battle of Uhud took place. Does anyone know when the Battle of Uhud took place? Approximately what year? 8th year? Too late. Third year, thank you. So, third year after Hijrah, after the migration to Medina. Okay? So, we're talking about, 16 years after the initial revelation, but there's still several years left to go, and most of the rules of Islam were introduced around this time. Jummah prayer, Friday prayer, fasting in Ramadan, formalized zakah with percentages, stuff like that, all introduced, around this era or this time. So that's the context. And Ibn Hajar Asqalani is very clear, one of the scholars. He said this was the first verse that clearly prohibited riba in the Quran. And, some scholars have also made, given an explanation that the Quraysh the Quraysh were the people who were from the Prophet's tribe, who were pagans, and they were fighting against the Muslims. So he says the Quraysh were financing the Battle of Uhud through usurious loans or through interest-based loans in order to fight the Muslims. So what's happening here is this verse is saying, do not copy what they're doing to go and finance your war so you can fight them back while, engaging in interest because of military reasons. So some of the explanations were given was that was the reason for the revelation of this verse around this time. Now, riba prior to this was probably disliked anyways, because there's some indications in the Quran which mention that, like alcohol, for example. When alcohol was prohibited, it was prohibited several years later after the initial revelation of the Quran. But there were indications that there was dislike for alcohol. So the same thing, the prohibition was not clear-cut, that you are not allowed at all, but there was kind of indications that, riba is not good for you in society and all of that stuff. But this is the first clear-cut prohibition that actually came down and made it clear. All right, the second verse is, it says, and because it's talking about the Jews, and it's talking about them and their problem and what happened with them, and it says, and because of their charging interest while they were prohibited from it, right? So they were charging interest even to each other. He's saying they were prohibited from doing that. They were not supposed to do that, and they did it. Now this was probably revealed around the period of, middle Medinan period, somewhere in the middle there, right? And what does this indicate? Now, why is this even significant? It's talking about the Jews. Well, what is significant is, if it's criticizing the Jews for taking interest, then that means that it's got to be something bad for the Muslims to take interest. Otherwise, you have no right to criticize them, right? So there's got to be something wrong with it, right? Number one. And number two, the type of interest that they're engaging in is the same type of interest that the Quran is talking about. So it's not a different context. It's not some different usage. So that's the relevance of the second verse. And then the third verse is the longest one, okay? And we're going to break it up, all right? So Surah Al-Baqarah, verses 275 to 281. Okay, so what happens here, it says, those who take interest will not stand, meaning on the Day of Judgment, except as one stands whom Satan has driven crazy by his touch. Meaning the person is going to be standing on the Day of Judgment, whoever takes interest, and they're going to be going crazy, insane, as if they've been possessed. And it says that's because they've said trading is just like riba, right? Trading is like interest. There's no difference between buying and selling, economics, just trade, barter, and charging extra money. But then Allah responds, says, but Allah has permitted trading and prohibited riba. He's prohibited that interest. So it's saying, no, there is a difference. There's a very significant difference. So Allah clarifies that part. And it says, so whoever receives an advice from his Lord and stops, Meaning now that you got it, this is, Allah is warning you one more time. The prohibition was already there. Okay? Allah is warning you again. If you get this, you learn it, and you stop, you're allowed to keep what you had in the past. Meaning you can keep your capital that you had loaned out. You can still get your loan back, but you can't get the interest back. And the matter will be up to Allah. And the ones who go back, they're going to be the people of the fire. They keep going back to consuming interest again, asking for interest again. They're going to be the people of the fire. They will remain there forever. So very serious threat. And then Allah says, Allah destroys riba and nourishes charities. Right? So Allah eliminates riba. He eliminates interest. There's not going to be any blessing in that. And then He says, وَيُرْبِ الصَّدَقَاتِ. And He nourishes, meaning He causes charities to grow, right? To multiply, to be blessed. And the interesting thing is the word yurbi sadaqat is the word riba. So basically Allah is saying Allah destroys riba, and riba literally means increase. It says Allah destroys riba or interest, and He does riba of charity. He causes increase in charity. It's like a play on words built into the language of the Quran. Many people don't see it in the translation, sadly. You should take an Arabic class. It helps. It's really interesting. So Allah mentions it that way. And then He says, Allah does not like any sinful disbeliever. And then He says, O you who believe, I skipped a little bit, O you who believe, fear Allah and give up what still remains of the interest that's left if you are believers. So whatever interest you had to collect, give that up. Just don't ask for it back. You have to give it up. If you're a believer, you got to just give that up. You can take your capital, but if you don't, then listen to the declaration of war from Allah and His Messenger. Allah and His Messenger are going to declare war on you. I mean, you can't get any worse than this. Alcohol is not mentioned in this way, right? Gambling is not mentioned in this way. Eating pork is not mentioned in this way. This is one of the most serious declarations of prohibition in the Quran that you can find. And if you repent, right, if you ask Allah for forgiveness, you can have your principal. Right? You can keep your principal. You can take your money back. And it says, neither you wrong, nor will you be wronged. Right? So neither you will wrong somebody else by taking interest that you shouldn't have been taking, nor will you be wronged. Right? Well, how would you be wronged? How could you potentially be wronged here? By not taking your principal back. Exactly. So if you didn't get your money back, you're like, I lost my whole thing. So because I engaged in interest, I lost everything? I'm wrong. How can I at least collect the $100 that I had loaned out initially? You'd be wrong because you would have lost the 100 plus your interest. So they give up the interest that you had, take your $100 back. It's okay. You can do that. Okay? Is there a clarification?
You cannot be wrong by having to pay interest. Having to pay interest is also you being wrong.
Yeah, I'm going to explain that in more detail. Yeah, it's coming up. Okay, so those are the verses about riba. Now you got some hadiths, all right? And then maybe we'll take a break soon, okay? So then you have a few hadiths. First of all, the Prophet, peace be upon him, he says, avoid the 7 great destructive sins. And among them, one of them is associating partners with Allah. So it's pretty serious, right? And one of them is interest. It's among the 7 major sins. He says, stay away from that. This is in Bukhari. Prophet ﷺ, he said, I had a dream one night, and he was telling his companions. And he says, we were walking through and we reached a river full of blood. And there was a man inside the middle of the river. And there was another man standing at the bank of the river. And every time the man who was at the middle of the river, he was swimming and he was trying to get out of the river, he would come near the bank. And the man who was standing there, he would take a rock and he would throw it into the mouth of the person, and the man would swallow it. And he would be pushed back and he would end up back stuck in the middle of the river. So after the dream was done, he asked the people who were taking him around, and these were angels, explaining to him what hellfire is going to be like. He asked, who was that person? And they said the person in the middle was the person who used to consume interest, who used to take interest. And if you think about why that is, basically the person keeps getting stuck, and what are they getting, right? They're opening their mouth to consume something. And when you take interest, it's called consuming interest. It's called aklu riba. You're eating riba, right? So this rock is representing the riba that you're getting. You're getting this little thing you think is going to satisfy you, and you're actually swallowing a rock, and it's putting that person being stuck, and he's repeating this forever, again and again and again. It's very, very serious way of showing what can happen to people who are going to be taking interest. This is in Bukhari. Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, he said, the Messenger of Allah cursed the one who consumed interest, the one who commissioned it, the people who witnessed it, and the one who recorded it. So if you're just sitting there and you're like, well, I'm not going to do it, but you want me to help you write the contract? Okay, I'll write the contract for you. The Prophet ﷺ cursed all of them and put them in the same category. So we have to be very cautious. And those are the hadith that condemn riba. Some of them, there's more of them. Then there's some hadith which define a little bit more about riba. They introduce a new type of riba, which the Prophet, peace be upon him, introduced. And this is known, so the riba we've been talking about, or interest so far, we've been talking about is known as riba and nasi'a. Right? This is the deferred payment. You take a loan and you're getting more money on that loan. There's a second type of riba, and that is hadith where one time Bilal was a companion of the Prophet. Bilal, he bought some dates. It says brought, but he brought. He brought some dates, and he wanted to get rid of these dates, and he wanted to buy more expensive dates. Okay, these dates were called Barni dates. Not related to Bernie, elections and stuff. But this was the type of dates. They were not very good dates, and he wants to sell them, and he wants to get something better. So he's doing that, and the Prophet ﷺ finds out. He goes, "Hey, wait a minute. You're going to trade these inferior dates for these better quality dates, right? Some are just something different quality." So he goes, "Yeah, I want to do that." He goes, "Don't do that. That's a type of interest. You cannot do that. That is wrong." So he said, "Well, what should I do, Messenger of Allah?" He says, "No, take your dates, sell them in the market, and then come back, take the money, and then you can go and you can buy those dates." Now, if you look at that, you say, "Well, what is that, like some ritualistic thing? Like why can't we just trade dates for dates? There's no big deal about that." The Prophet ﷺ forbade that for a specific reason. So we're not going to get into a lot of detail on that, but to explain to you what's happening is there can be room for exploitation here, right? And what the Prophet is doing is telling him of this concept of you have to mark your dates to the market price, called marking to market. And what that's going to do is going to prevent potential exploitation. So it's not just some ritualistic thing. The Prophet ﷺ, he prohibited that for several different reasons. Why? And that's just one of the reasons. So another hadith that he mentioned, he says, gold for gold. When you're trading gold for gold, just like the date example, it's not allowed to trade good quality gold for bad quality gold or vice versa in different amounts. They have to be the same amount, right? Because there's going to be some potential exploitation there. He said silver for silver, same thing, because gold and silver were the currencies, right? There's no deferred time here. Still, you're not allowed to do it. Wheat for wheat, not allowed. Barley for barley, not allowed. Dates for dates, not allowed. And salt for salt, not allowed. So it's these 6 things, and he says any increase in this is going to be considered to be type of interest. So these are the hadiths that we have pretty much about interest. Okay. Now we're going to take these verses, we're going to take these hadiths, and we're going to try to come up with the definition of riba in Islam according to the way the scholars understood these verses, according to the way the scholars understood these hadiths. So should we do that, or should we take a break? Yes. So we're going to let Umar talk, and then we're going to take a 15-minute break.
Yeah, I just wanted to explain this hadith a bit further because it can be confusing for people. I think people understand the concept of I loan someone $100 and then I ask in a year, give that back to me as 110, right? I think people understand the concept of lending money and then getting interest on that. But they struggle with, if you're exchanging one type of dates for another type of dates, why is that a problem? Like, why is that an issue? So the scholars have talked about this, and Ibn Rushd, I think, commented on it as well, right? And so there's been discussions about why is this being prohibited? It's either being prohibited because it is interest, or it is being prohibited because it may lead to interest. The best explanation I can offer is, how many people have studied economics, macroeconomics? Anyone? We have 3, 4 people. Okay, good. So some people have studied the concept of money, right? Economists define what money is, and there's a long definition, M1, M2, and money supply and all that stuff, right? But they define the functions of money. And they say the functions of money are as follows. Number one, money is a medium of exchange. Because if every time I wanted to buy something from someone, I have to trade something like, hey, take my iPhone and give me like, this many dates, it would be very hard, right? It's very hard to constantly barter and make deals. I'll exchange my laptop for 20 microphones or whatever. It's very hard to operate that way. So money provides a medium of exchange. This is not necessarily from Islam. This is just economics, right? What does money do? Money is a medium of exchange. Allows you to say this laptop is worth whatever, $3,000, and this phone is worth $1,000. So I can have what I can do is I can just use money instead of always having to trade goods. Related to that is money is a measure or a unit of value, right? So related to this is, how do I figure out what something's worth? Again, I say, this is $3,000. It helps me understand that 3 iPhones of this type are equivalent to 1 laptop of this type, right? I don't have to constantly try and figure that out. We have these monetary values. In fact, it makes our life easy, right? So money, Islam's not against money. Some people think Islam's against money. Islam's not against money. Islam has no problem with what's called fiat currency. So fiat currency, the dollar bills that you have, checks, bank accounts, checking accounts, all of that, Islam's not against that. We don't have to go to dirham and dinar. We don't have to go back to just bartering and trading. Anyway, so the idea here is the money is, again, an exchange of value, and then a measure of value. And then the third function of money that economists talk about is money is a store of value, okay? That you can store value inside money. Now, Islam doesn't recognize that, and that's why riba is prohibited, is because we don't believe that money itself has value. We think money is used to exchange one type of good for money, and then you exchange it for another type of good. So that's the ultimate goal, is money, not money itself, but what money brings you. So what's this hadith trying to say? The hadith is trying to say if you try to exchange one type of dates for another type of dates, there's a possibility that you might be exploited. That somebody might say, you know what, I'll trade you like so many of these dates for so many of that dates, but you might get confused, something might go wrong in that transaction, and you might end up trading, for example, if I say, I'll give you $100, you give me 120, right? That wouldn't be fair. That wouldn't be right. So the Prophet ﷺ said, in order to avoid that, why don't you convert the dates into money and then convert the money back into dates, because then you don't have that problem. Now I'm guaranteed that I converted this number of dates into $100 worth of dates into $100, and that $100 back into $100 worth of the other type of dates. And that kind of makes sure that you don't get exploited. And we'll talk more about why riba is prohibited later, and maybe you'll understand how this fits into that. So I just wanted to share that.
Can I share a story real quick in regards to that exploitation? That actually is a cool story last night. A friend of mine runs a store, a clothing store, and he had a customer who comes in and gets provided uniforms by their company, but he doesn't like that type of uniform. He likes another kind. So he brings it to my friend and he tells him, hey, why don't I give you this and you give me this brand? I give you this brand, it's more expensive. You give me the other brand. And my friend goes, okay, but on one condition, it's 1-to-1. He goes, yeah, no problem. So he gives them that, and they exchange, 2 uniforms for 2 uniforms. And then 3 minutes later, no sooner than the guy walked out of the store, another guy comes in, grabs some things off the shelf, shoplifts, and leaves. And when my friend went in and calculated the cost of that shoplifting, it was the same exact cost, the difference between what was exchanged. So I just thought it was ironic that this story was told last night, that
Yeah.
exploitation ended up essentially without what?
Yeah.
Exploitation of the other guy, and he ended up paying for it, by the way, because of shoplifting.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair.
I had a question about that in regards to dates. If I had premium dates and you had the inferior dates, but I'm in a market where I'm predominantly surrounded by poor people, today's inferior dates make no sense to keep. So if we traded, it's not necessarily like exploiting, because now I have inferior dates that I can sell at a lower price for
Yep.
customers versus you have the
Yeah, the question was if you have, let's say I have inferior dates, and Sheikh Mustafa, just came back from Medina. He's got like the amazing high quality ajwa dates. And I'm trying to sell in a market where, let's say, like I'm trying to sell in or he's trying to sell in a market where you've got poor people and they're not desiring the high quality dates, or they just can't afford it. They're desiring it, maybe they can't afford it. So it makes more sense for him to have the lower quality dates. Why can't he just trade them with me? The answer is the problem is not the fact that he's trying to get the inferior quality dates. There's no issue with that. It's completely fine to have a customer market, a market segment, as we would call it in marketing, and cater the products to that market segment, right? You want to make money. So you want to make sure you're providing the product that your customers desire, and they have the willingness and the ability to afford it, right? I'm speaking in conventional finance and economics terms, right? So you want to provide the right product for the right market. There's nothing wrong with that Islamically. The issue that the Prophet ﷺ was trying to avoid was somehow like what the brother was describing happened at a store with like, a certain quality of uniform being traded for another quality of uniform. And really think about what happened there, right? So a customer went into a uniform shop, and he was allowed to buy a certain quality, and he said, no, I want a different quality. He ended up getting a higher quality for the same price. But it's not really fair. Higher quality should be charged at a higher price. So we're trying to be fair here. So in order to guarantee the fairness, the idea would be that he would, maybe if I had we don't have to literally like say, here's cash, give me the dates, and then he gives me cash and I give him those dates. Islam's not about like following, like Shaykh Mustafa said, it's not the ritual that matters, right? What matters is the essence of the transaction and what actually happens. So we need to just sit down and say, look, you've got 30 kilograms of ajwa dates, so many dollars per kilogram, that's equal to this many dollars, right? And I say, I've got the lower quality dates, they're so many kilograms, it's equivalent to this many dollars, right? And we calculate that. We could put it in Excel, Google Sheets, in our phones, whatever. If we can remember it in our head, great, right? We calculate. We're trying to find the equivalent value, right? And then we just say, you know what? Actually, the money itself doesn't have to exchange hands. We need to make sure that the dates being exchanged are being converted into the measure of money. So again, it's not the ritual or like do this, then this, then this, like stand on one leg and raise your hand, and if you trade dates this way, this will be halal, but if you trade it that way, if you're lying down and doing this, it won't be halal. That's not the idea. That's not how Islam operates, right? The idea is to make sure to prevent exploitation. We convert that into a measure or unit of value that we recognize so that the trade is fair and I don't exploit him, maybe maliciously or accidentally, because a lot of this can happen by accident. And he does not do the same back to me.
And if you've ever been involved with like anyone done like trading cards when you were young with kids, pogs or something like that, you know what happens with kids when you're trading those cards and you're trading those pogs. The one who's got the inferior quality cards, they're the ones who usually gets ripped off. And the reason why is because the person who's got the inferior stuff, they're looking at that one really expensive card. They're like, man, I'm willing to give extra of my little ones that have very little value. I'll give you 20 of those that are worth like $1 each for your $10 card, because these are all $1 cards. So you end up actually losing because you're not making that mark, but you want this very rare pog or rare card or rare whatever collectible item. This happens to a lot of teenagers and younger people. So and imagine how they feel later on when they go back and they're like, I just lost this value, because a lot of people get manipulated. That's why making this marking to market concept of determining a value actually prevents that potential for exploitation that's there. Yeah. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So number one, there's the type of interest that we define that is very, very clear. Okay, that clear type is I give you $100 and then I say, give it back to me in a year as 110. That part is called riba al-Quran or riba from the Quran, also called riba nasi'a, right? That part's very clear. It's kind of like within Islam, it's within the scholarship of Islam and the valid opinions that we find. It's not really controversial. It's pretty well understood and clear. The riba of fadl, which is what we're talking about, the riba of exchange, you know, dates for dates, wheat for wheat, barley for barley. This one's a little bit more confusing for people, okay? So much so that the scholars have differed about exactly what to do with this hadith, okay? So since you asked the question, I'll provide a little bit more detail, right? So the question becomes, the Prophet ﷺ listed, 6 items? Right, 6 items. He listed 6 items and he said, these are the things where you can't exchange them, right? Dates for dates, wheat for wheat, barley for barley, etc. So people are trying to figure out, so the scholars, the jurists, have put in some effort to figure out, is it just these 6 items? Because guess what? US dollar bills are not included in there. It's not in the hadith. The Prophet ﷺ did not say US dollar bills. So are we allowed to trade US dollar bills, right? Majority of scholars said, no, it's not just limited to the hadith. There's probably more to it. Let's try and understand the rationale and the logic, right? Which is what we're all trying to do. So some of them said, you know what? What's common between the 6 items? Maybe it's food. Maybe you just can't take food things that are the same and trade them, right? Maybe it's not food. Maybe it's anything that can be consumed. So, you know, dates can be consumed, right? Wheat can be consumed. Gasoline can be consumed. So what if I exchange, you know, 87 quality gas with 89 or whatever? You know, is that okay or not okay? So some jurists will say, no, it's anything that can be consumed, right? Some say it's food items. Some would say, no. What's common between these things is they can clearly be measured. So anything that can be measured, maybe that's what we're not supposed to trade. Quite frankly, I mean, these differences of opinion exist amongst the madhahib, right? So if you're Maliki, Hanafi, Hanbali, Shafi'i, whatever, you will find that they each had their own opinions on how to read this hadith, how to understand this saying of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Quite frankly, I would say we don't need to dwell on that. Like the jurists have disagreed, but we don't need to sit here and try and go like, okay, is wheat okay, but how about whole wheat? You know, how about like, you know, non-fat milk versus this? And I mean, we can sit here and talk about that, but it's not really worthwhile, right? So our trading cards in scope or not, our books in scope or not, I don't know, right? What's more important is that we try and understand the concept and the spirit of what this is trying to accomplish. Because it will be hard exactly to understand literally what he meant in every single category of product that we can buy. So what's important here is that we understand this concept of if there's a possibility, if we see that there's a possibility of exploiting someone, like maybe with trading cards, right? And maybe kids have experienced this, or whatever the modern equivalent is to trading cards. What is it? Do we have one? Sama's cards are very popular. Samawari's cards are very popular. But there's got to be some equivalent where people are exchanging things. And we see kids do this. We see them intentionally trying to exploit other kids, right? And adults try and do this sometimes. It's important then when we're conducting those types of transactions, when we see that there's a possibility of exploitation, that we try and find an equivalency. The basic idea is try and say, look, I'm exchanging Shakespeare's books for Thomas Friedman's books. I think that was your example. What do I do in this situation? Well, think about it. Don't just like get carried away with like, oh, I like Shakespeare so much more or whatever. Think about Shakespeare's books, go on eBay or Craigslist or whatever and say, okay, they're worth this much. Thomas Friedman's books are worth this much. Let's just make sure it's a fair exchange. We should do that anyway. We should do our due diligence when we conduct transactions, something we're not talking about, but when you're investing in a business, when you're conducting a transaction, when you're buying something, you look at the price. You make sure you're paying the right price. That's all this is really trying to say is when you're dealing with that with money, it clicks on our head very quickly. When you're trying to do an exchange sometimes, it doesn't click right away. And some people, especially, you know, you mentioned children as a good example. Children don't always, they get more emotional. We're going to talk a little bit about behavioral economics, right? But these are the things where you just have to try and be extra careful. Okay. So
Quran, in the verses that we saw, it mentions the term riba, but it doesn't define what riba is. It doesn't say, you know what, and the definition of riba is this on money with this time factor. It doesn't say those things. So the question is, well, why doesn't it say those things, right? There's got to be some reason why Allah didn't define it in detail. Because some people can come along and say, well, maybe it means something else. Maybe it has a different understanding. So the thing is, when Allah prohibits certain things which are well known, He doesn't sit there and give a definition. So when Allah prohibits pork in the Quran, He doesn't define what is pork. Pork, a pig is a type of animal, and it has this many legs, and it looks like this, and it's well known, right? When Allah prohibits alcohol, He doesn't go into detail and say, you know what, khamr, it's like, it's made from this thing, and it looks like this, and it smells like this, and it causes this effect and all that. It's not there. Gambling, adultery, all these things which are prohibited, they're not defined. Even adultery is not defined. If you do this move and you have to touch like this and it doesn't go into detail. Why? Because when something is so well known and something is so clear in that society, it doesn't require a detailed definition. So when it came to defining riba, Allah did not give this long, detailed, or even a bare detailed definition of riba in the Quran, because it was so well known, right? So that's number one. How do we know it was so well known? The definition, well, let me continue. So other societies have been practicing riba, interest, throughout history, right? And that's well known. The Quran, when Allah reveals the scripture, the Arabs know that. People understand that. They are aware that there's interest being charged on transactions. The reference to the Jews in the Quran is there, very clear cut, because the riba that the Jews were using, or the ribit that they mention, it's the same as the one that you find is being mentioned in the Quran. Now, what is the common feature of all interest, usury transactions, riba transactions? It's this definition, is that there is an increased amount charged on the principal of debt. That is basically the common feature or the understanding of all of this. But when we look at it from this perspective, when we look at the term riba and we talk about the word interest or usury, we need to differentiate between a few things. Number one, our understanding of the word interest today is different than people's understanding of the word interest in the past, right? Depending on which society you're in. So the first principle we have to keep in mind is that not all interest is riba. Now this is going to be very uncomfortable for some people to hear this. They're like, wait a minute. So you're telling me that there are some types of interest that are halal and that they're okay? And the answer is yes. That's correct. Right? And now you shouldn't leave the seminar like right now at this moment. You're like, that's what I was waiting for, man. Thank you so much. You're like, you're out of here. You're like, you got, right? So just pay attention and understand this idea. So interest as a term today is much wider than just with loans. There's this concept of the time value of money, right? That your money that you're spending has, when you buy something now with a certain price, there's a value for the time factor that's involved. And that is significantly different than the riba that is being prohibited in Islam. Now, there have been a few, I think mostly modern scholars, Muslim scholars, who made the argument that there is no such thing as time value for money in Islam. Among those who made the argument was Maulana Maududi and Mullah Sadr, two very well-known revivalists in the Muslim community, in the Muslim Ummah. But the reality is, this is actually considered to be a very weak and mostly unsubstantiated opinion, because the vast majority across the board in history of Muslim scholars, they said that this idea that time has a share in the price of an object when you're selling something. Okay, when you're selling something. And they're saying it's justified to have that due to the opportunity cost of deferring the compensation of that person. So I'll give you an example. Still recovering from the flu. All right, so example would be, let's say I want to sell this recorder, okay? This audio recorder here. I want to sell it now for $10 to Umar. I'm going to sell it to him, and I bought it for $5. Okay? So when I sell it to him now, I say, you could buy this for $10 right now. If he buys it, how much profit am I going to make? No, how much money? $5, right? Okay. So if I say, if he says, you know what, I really want it, but I don't have $10 with me. And $10 is a little bit expensive right now. So I'll actually buy it, but I'm going to pay you at the end of the year, but I'll pay you 15, right? And I'm saying, okay, you know what? I'm willing to sell this to you for $15, and you can pay me at the end of the year, right? You could either buy it now for $10, or you could buy it at the end of the year for $15. And how much did I buy it for? For $5. Now the first question is this allowed for me to do this? Okay, so according to the vast majority of scholars in Islam, it's allowed, because this is an asset. I'm not giving a loan, right? This is not a trick, this is not a strategy. I'm not trying to, loan him money or something like that. I'm actually trying to sell this item that belongs to me. It's in my possession. I took the risk of owning it, and he wants this item from me. Okay, so this is number one. So the second question I have for you then is, if that's allowed, which it is, according to all four schools of Islamic law, according to the vast majority of scholars, this is allowed to do that. I can give him two different prices. I can sell you this recorder for $10 right now, or if you pay me now, or $15, deferred payment, you can pay me after 1 year, $15. So the question now is, he goes with the $15 option, because he doesn't have the $10 with him. I sell him the recorder, okay? How much profit did I make? $10? Anyone else? Unknown? I bought it for $5. He pays me back after a year, assuming that he pays me back, right? Depreciation of the no inflation, assuming no inflation, no adjustment for inflation. How much profit did I earn? $10. Everyone says $10.
$10 in December, but when you look at December, the $10 really worth 7 or 6.
No, not counting inflation. Let's assume deflation. So I'm okay. So yes, I made $10 profit, but how do I understand the concept? When I use the word $10, how is that understood in modern terminology? There's actually $5 profit that I made from the sale, and what's the other $5 called for the time? It's called interest. It's called interest. Is it halal? In this example right now, is it halal for me to take the other $5? So I have $5 profit, and I have $5 interest, which makes $10 that I'm making. You pick. It doesn't matter. Is it halal for me to take the $5 and the other $5? Well, I'm only getting the extra 5 from him, so I get my $10. So $5 is my profit. All right, Omar's gonna chime in now to clarify some things, right? So, can it be cold? Yeah. Go. Okay. So, regardless of all that, my question is this: when I made $10 profit, everyone was fine. Right? When I made $10 profit, everyone is okay. When I change it and I start calling the first $5 my profit, and I call the other $5 interest that I made, I'm just giving it a different name. So it's $10 profit, but how are you breaking it down? What term? What do you list it in your accounting? $5 usury. In the Islamic state of, whatever, right? Go ahead.
So the way that you're hearing it be explained may not be something that you're used to, and even if you've studied Islamic finance, this is typically not how it's explained. But we're trying to be real here. We're trying to make sure people understand from a conventional terminology standpoint that interest, like it says in the slide, not all interest is riba, right? So we're not saying that this is riba, absolutely not. Riba is not permissible ever. Quran is very clear. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu la ta'kulu riba. Do not consume riba, period. Okay? So this is not riba. However, we're trying to explain that conventionally, everyone calls it interest. If you buy a car this way, and you go to the car dealership, they're not going to say like, this is our profit. They're going to say, this is the profit, this is the interest. That's what you're going to see in the accounting books. That's what you're going to see in the general ledger. You're going to see it in all the accounting books. That's how it's going to show up. And in fact, even if you're a Muslim, you're running a business and you're doing it this way, you're going to make sure to call it interest. Why are you going to call it interest? Tax benefits, right? You're going to call it interest, right? Because of the tax benefits. So it's important to understand we're calling it interest because that's how modern economics defines it. And that's what we're trying to say is like that $5 is coming from profit and the other $5. By the way, there's a lot of conditions around this. We'll talk about it next weekend. You know, like, can I do this with like any type of object? What if like I sold something to you and then I sell it back, do all these things? Like, what if I play more tricks with it, right? Because you can have a lot of fun with this. But you can have a lot of fun and turn it haram as well. So how do we keep it halal, right? Does anyone have an issue with the halalness of this transaction? Anyone have concerns or issues? Because that's important to address. Doesn't this have the same concept of getting money without putting in the effort? Okay, so did I have to put in effort to acquire this device? Or did Shaykh Mustafa have to put in the effort to acquire the device? He already has it. Did he have to put in the effort to find a buyer, to negotiate a price, to do all of that? Yep. Yes, yes. So in this case, I think we want to make it clear. So we talked a lot about like the Christian arguments and the Jewish arguments and so on, right? And how they talked about opportunity cost and all these different things. We want to make sure now we're understanding this purely from an Islamic standpoint, right? So number one, like the problem that we have is not solely with the lack of effort. The problem is also the lack of effort on making money from purely money. Because money itself doesn't have, in Islam, money itself is not a store of value. Money itself is think about it, it's a means to an end. Money, if you just had money, if I put you in the middle of nowhere and I gave you a big safe with $1 billion and you had no way to contact anyone else in the world, it's worthless, right? So in economics we say the money has no intrinsic value, right? In fact, we know that. The only reason the dollar bill has value is what? We what? We give it value. So we don't just give it value, everybody does, because there's something in there that says, you know, it's backed up by the US Treasury, all this stuff, and, you know, in God we trust. There's all this stuff on the dollar bill. I don't know why the in God and trust is there, we trust is there, but there's, huh?
It came later.
Yeah, it came later, but because I guess you have to rely on God is because the money is not backed up with anything, you know? So you have to trust in God that you're actually going to get some value out of it, right? So the money itself is backed up by the federal government, right? That it has value. But intrinsically, it has no value. So Islam doesn't recognize the value of the money, and that's why what Islam is trying to get you to do is make productive use of things. Make use of your assets, make use of your wealth, and money that's just, money doesn't have any use, use it as a means towards an end. There's a couple of other questions about the halalness. Go ahead. Yeah, hold that thought, and we'll get to that, inshallah, in much more detail.
Maybe we'll get to this later on or something, but you know, this example of the digital tape, the digital recorder. You know, when we saw
Tape? What's tape? What you talking about? Sorry, I'm just messing with you, yeah. Tape recorder. Yeah.
when he tells you this, he says $10 now or $15 later, and you say, okay, I'll do
Yep. Okay. Save that question. Save that question. Ask it later, inshallah, when I get to my area. Yeah. Yeah. One more. Do you have a good answer, a quick answer to that one?
The Islamic wisdom.
Yeah. So the question is it a good definition to say, like, Islamically, you didn't have to put in any effort? No, I think it is an incomplete definition. Okay? If I happen to, you can make arguments about, like, what if I bought something with almost zero effort because it just kind of fell in my lap and the money just, there's a lot of arguments you can make. So it's not just the fact of zero effort. It is the fact of the effort combined with the fact that money itself doesn't have intrinsic value. Those two kind of go together. Do you agree with that? Yeah. So those. Yeah. So it's a principle. The more important than the effort is, let's call it risk. Okay. What Islam wants you to do is when you buy something or sell something or invest in something, it wants to make sure that any risk that's involved in that is being shared. And we'll talk more about this. So maybe it'll become more clear there. But the idea is the risk must be shared, and then the profits get shared, the losses get shared, and all of that happens. So we'll get to that. But the idea is it's less about the effort and more about the risk. And what I might be doing is, a lot of times what people are trying to do, a lot of modern finance, fintech, a lot of the modern instruments of finance, hedge funds, high frequency trading, things like hedging in general, right? The concept of hedging, the concept of insurance, all of these instruments are designed to reduce or eliminate risk. Okay, so a lot of modern finance, what people do isn't, only the rich can afford to do this, by the way. So what the rich do is they build these funds and instruments and vehicles of trade, and they build them in a way that they will make money and there's no way they'll lose. That's the kind of stuff Islam is trying to avoid, is to make sure that when two parties are involved in a business, that the risk is shared. So I think a lot of these questions will get more answered as we go through the topics. So let's get through those, and inshallah we'll come back, okay?
So that is, not all interest is riba. So even if I term my $10 of profit as $5 profit and $5 interest, which is the way that we look at the term interest today, it's more of a wider term. It is not riba. So that other $5 is not riba. The $5 profit is not riba, and the $5 interest is not riba in this type of transaction, because the commodity is involved and because the time value of money is factored into the sale of a commodity. That's the only reason why. Now, if I gave a loan, right, and there was no commodity involved, and I said, I'm gonna give you $10 and you're gonna pay me back $15 at the end of the year, and I say, well, that's interest. That interest is riba. This interest, if we call it interest, it's not riba, it's profit. If you very uncomfortable with that, just call it profit. All right? call it interest profit or profit interest or some kind of, hyphenated word or something like that. You can call it whatever you want, right? But it's not riba. Okay. If I give him $10 as a loan and ask for $15 at the end, that is interest and riba. Okay? The $5 that I'm making, the $5 of profit that I made from the sale, and the $5 of profit, 5 additional dollars of profit I also made from the sale as a time value money factor, that I can call it profit, I can call it interest, but it's not riba. And I can hyphenate it, and I can call it profit interest or interest profit, or I can come up with some new cool term, right? Like the Islamic finance industry is very good at, utilizing Arabic terms. I just open up Arabic dictionary and just come up with like some random, I'll call it zaid, right? I'll just come up with some real, cool term, and then we'll Islamize it, basically. And then you don't want to feel uncomfortable anymore. But the reality is, whatever you call it, it's called interest in the modern economy, but it's not riba. So that's the key to keep in mind. Not all interest is riba. Okay? All riba is riba. Yes? Mm. We're going to get to inflation. We'll get to inflation soon. Where it's coming. Yeah. Okay, I can sell this instead to him. I have to be selling something, right? So let's say you go to buy a car. Okay, you go to the difference between financing a car and leasing a car. Is there interest rate when it comes to financing the car? Is there interest rate when it comes to leasing the car? Is there a difference between the two? Hmm. Yes. Right. So there's another. Sometimes it can be the same, depending on what's going on in the background, right? But there's a difference between the transactions. So even though we're using the same term, there's a big difference between that. Yes, sir. Yeah. There you go. It's a time value of the commodity. That's a better way to put it. Yeah. So rather than time value of money, time value of the commodity. Yes. Mm, no. In terms of like, yeah, the price has to be clear when you're selling an item, and you can't make an adjustment later on the price. If you made an adjustment on the price, it'd be a huge problem. Yeah, that would end up becoming riba. Yeah. So that plays a big role. The terms of the contract. Absolutely. Yeah. That's why he was saying, Shaykh Umar was saying that you can easily play with this and reshape it into different transactions, which are all riba. Right? And a lot of people do that. But in the example that I gave you, the very simple, basic example, that would not be riba. Okay? All right, so that's principle number one. Now you flip that around. Not all riba is interest. Right? It becomes more confusing. So there is riba that is prohibited, which is not interest. So normally you think riba is equal to interest. But now we just broke that apart with two ideas here. So which type, this is actually, it's not that significant, but it's good to kind of keep in your mind that riba is an independent concept. So which riba is not interest? Interest is on something deferred. So when we talked about Bilal doing the dates for dates, that example that we were talking about, and the trading cards and all that, it's not time factor in there, right? So interest has a time factor. There's no time factor in this transaction, but it's riba, and it's prohibited. Therefore, not all riba is interest. Okay, so the riba, the Bilal trading the dates is prohibited. The Prophet said this is riba. It's a different type of riba. It's called riba al-fadl. And the other one is riba al-nasi'a, the one where there's a loan being given here. So here, that the Prophet called that transaction of dates for dates in unequal quantities, he called it riba. Is it interest? Is what Bilal was doing of trading dates for dates, was it interest? No. Because again, so what we're trying to say is the translation of riba technically is not interest. It usually is, but it isn't always. Okay? So it usually is, but it's not always. That's all we're trying to explain here. Okay, is that part clear? No? A little bit? Okay. We're going to give you the recording anyways, so you're going to get a chance to go back, and you can just listen to it 10 times, and you'll get it, inshallah.
We're going to revisit some of these concepts.
And some concepts will come back, yeah, inshallah. Okay. Now, why was riba, and now from now on, now that that slide is done, I'm going to sometimes simultaneously use the term riba, interest, and usury to refer to the same thing. Okay? Just now that that slide is over, now that you got that part, okay, so why is riba prohibited? Okay? There's a reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala prohibited riba, and there's wisdom behind it, right? So before you start reading this slide, probably should have left that out. But anyways, before you start reading this slide, I'm just going to leave it on this slide. So what's the reason why riba is prohibited? Well, good, because Allah said so, right? And period. There's nothing else to discuss, right? There's absolutely nothing else to talk about. Allah said it. You don't need to rationalize it. You don't need to understand it. It doesn't need to make any sense to you. It's like if Allah told you to stand on one foot, you just do it. You don't ask questions, and you don't need to worry about anything. Is that the right mentality? The correct mentality. Who agrees with this mentality? Raise your hand. Who agrees this is the right mentality, and you should not reflect further at all? Okay. All right. So technically the answer is correct. When Allah tells you to stay away from it, period, you stay away from it. From a practical perspective, it's done in your mind. You don't question whether you're gonna do it again anyways. But do you question why did Allah prohibit that? Why? What's the wisdom? Did Allah have some reasoning behind it, or no? We don't even want to. It doesn't even matter. It doesn't even bother us why He prohibited it. We don't even need to reflect upon that, right? So there's two approaches that people have to understanding Islam. And the first approach is there's no need to ask detailed questions. There's no need to try to understand why Allah did this. Just He tells you to fast, just fast. You want to know, well, what do we get out of fasting? Just fast. It's Ramadan. You don't have to, it doesn't matter. You're hungry, stop thinking about it. And the second approach is there's got to be some, there's an underlying wisdom there. Allah doesn't do anything unless there's a wisdom there. So what is the wisdom? Can we start to understand and figure out what is the underlying wisdom behind it? And when we begin to understand the wisdom, does that help us in any way, not only to understand it, but to understand where it applies and where it doesn't apply? Okay? So that's why it's very important to take what I call the rational approach versus the irrational approach. Rational approach doesn't mean it. Here's the wrong rational approach. Rational approach for some people is, if it doesn't make sense to me, then I'm not going to follow it. That's not what we're saying. We're saying is, yeah, Allah said it, I'm going to follow it, but there's a rational reason behind it, and I'm going to use my mind. People should use their mind to try to understand what's the underlying reason behind it, so we can appreciate, the wisdom of Allah, and we can also explain to other people why it's a problem. We could be proud as Muslims why this is not allowed. So when we look at why is alcohol not allowed, many people it goes straight to their mind. Oh man, look at all the drunk drivers and people beating up their families, and it's pretty easy, especially in America, to make an argument, even with the people who are non-Muslims who drink a lot. It's not that difficult. Muslims don't feel embarrassed to make an argument, say, alhamdulillah, we avoid alcohol. There's a great reason why. Look at it, protects our mind. We're not doing those things that other people are doing and all that stuff. So there's a great wisdom behind it. When we talk about gambling, it's in the same category. There's a reason why Allah prohibited it. When we think about it, it's not that difficult to explain to people. Even those who are gambling, you're in Las Vegas and you're trying to convince your non-Muslim friend, you kind of understand, hey, no, there's a good reason why Allah prohibited gambling, right? So when it comes to those type of things, when it comes to interest or when it comes to riba, there is a reason and an approach that we should take to understand the underlying principle where it makes sense. And we could be as comfortable with the prohibition of riba as we are with the prohibition of gambling, as we are with the prohibition of alcohol, and maybe some other prohibitions that exist in Islam. If we ignore the underlying wisdom behind it, it's very easy to get stuck with what the Vatican did with the Medici Bank, right? And it's like, we can structure this dual transaction where I could be borrowing money, and as long as technically it doesn't fall into that very literal category of what we defined as riba, then it's not riba. So we're going to be okay. So I'll give you an example, okay? So you can easily structure a sale so that it will amount to something that is equivalent to interest, and you say, but it doesn't fit the technical definition of interest because you don't care to even understand how interest, functions. So there's this idea of, the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law. This idea of form versus function. Okay, so this is really important to understand when it comes to riba. So for example, let's say, Omar wants to borrow $100 from me. Okay? And I'm thinking, you know what? That's a good idea. I can get you $100, but I need $110 back. What's going to happen? He's going to say, Astaghfirullah, man, that's haram. You know, we can't do that. You know. And I said, well, I'm going to need my $10. I'm just not going to give you $100. He goes, okay, I have another idea. Here's the idea. I got this Apple Watch, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sell you this Apple Watch for $110. Okay? This is $110, and I'm going to let you pay me later. Okay? So now you have this watch. You owe me how much money at the end of the year? $110, right? And I go, you know what? But now that I think about it, I really need my watch, actually. So I'm going to buy that watch for you for $100. And I have $100 in my pocket right now. So I give him $100 cash, and I get my watch back, and I put my watch back on, right? So now basically Umar has how much money in his pocket? $100. And how much money does he owe me after a year? $110. I got exactly what I wanted. This is perfect. But it's not riba because there was two separate sale transactions that took place, right? So what is wrong with this contract? If we look at it from a very narrow, literal perspective, you can easily make a contract like this, right? This buyback type of transaction where you've accomplished the exact same thing that a riba transaction would accomplish, but it doesn't technically fall in the category of riba because there were two separate sale transactions that happened, right? Huh? The question, who are you trying to fool? We're trying to fool Allah. That's what ends up happening when people take this approach, right? And this approach becomes a big problem when people don't understand the purpose, underlying purpose and wisdom behind riba. So that's what we need to. You can combine transactions together, and you can easily make an interest contract out of it. And you know what? Many people get convinced. They say, well, wait a minute, hold on. If you have a salad, okay, and in your salad there's lettuce, halal, tomatoes, halal, cheese is halal, depending on what kind of cheese you have. The whole rennet thing, we're not going to get into that. Get the cheese out of there. You got croutons, right? Don't get into L-cysteine and all that stuff. What else is in a salad, right? You got dressing and you got olives, okay? All halal ingredients separately. So you're telling me that if we combine them all together, it can end up becoming haram? In food? No. In finance? Yes. All right? Absolutely yes. And people don't understand that concept. So if you apply that idea with food, and you apply analogy to it in economics, it does not work because you can easily make it into a riba transaction. So it's very important. Actually, we're not there yet. So it's very important to understand the purpose behind things, okay? Now, what is the underlying wisdom? I'll just put up the slide on here. What is the underlying wisdom behind individual wisdom? Why Allah prohibited interest, right, as a contract? So now we're going to look at behavioral economics, right, in terms of how people function as consumers, as people who want to buy things. Don't start reading the slide yet. I see some of you reading it. Don't read. Read it later. Okay, I'm just putting on just read the title. Purpose. We're on the purpose of the prohibition. Okay, so understand in behavioral economics, there's this principle known as delay discounting, which basically means that human beings, they would like to have some immediate reward right now, even if it's smaller or if it's lesser, over some long-term delay that's going to come later, right? So a lot of people, you'll go to them and you're like, look, I can give you $5 right now, or I can give you $10 a month from now. Which one would you want? And there'd be many people, they would choose the $5 right now. And you say, well, no, $10 is pretty good. Say, okay, I tell you what, change it. It's going to be $6. 2 months from now, you go, oh, now the $5 is looking much better, right? And if you change it to $5.50, 3 months from now, you have even more people saying, now the $5 is looking much better. And more people start jumping on the $5. The more you lower the amount, right? And the more you extend the delay. So when there's a delay, you're discounting the value in your mind due to that delay. Right? It doesn't have the same value because it's further away, and I want something closer. I want something right now. So that's where one of the behavioral economics reasons of why riba is prohibited comes into play. Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to clarify that what the mind is doing is correct, by the way. So what the mind should look at it that way and say, $5 today might be better than $5.50 3 months from now, right? You have to do the math to figure that out. The problem that happens, and scientists have done this study again and again and again, the level of discounting that the human mind applies, and this applies to all of us in this room, by the way, is we automatically apply a level of discount that is far above what we should apply. So our mind is skewed, and we don't think about this correctly. If you sat down and did it in a spreadsheet, you'd go, oh my God, I made a stupid decision. If I take that $5, put it into stocks or whatever, I could have, I can't even make that much money. Why didn't I just take that money? So the level that we do it is not rational. It can't be explained. It's not logical. It's not rational. It doesn't compute. The math does not add up. But this is what the human mind does. So be careful when you're thinking about making these decisions, by the way, in general. Is the human mind does not do this correctly naturally. You have to make an extra effort and put it in a spreadsheet or something like that.
So there's a professor of economics, name is Dr. Mahmoud Al-Gamal. He made an interesting argument. He says, the reason why riba has been prohibited in Islam is because there needs to be a pre-commitment mechanism which prevents people from making that irrational decision, right? And that's this idea of pre-commitment in economics, right? So let me explain to you what pre-commitment is, okay? So pre-commitment, you know what a commitment means. You commit to doing something. Here, pre-commitment, you're committing to doing something in advance of you actually doing it, right? So why would you do something like that? Basically, if you want to increase your chance for success in something, in advance, you make a commitment so it's harder or impossible for your future self to back out of that. So it's like, this is short-term pleasure, and I'm going to get some long-term benefit. So let's take an example. Let's say you smoke, right? So what's a pre-commitment mechanism you can use to stop smoking? You say, you know what? I'm never going to carry cigarettes with me. So every time I need a cigarette, I'm going to have to go, and I'm going to have to ask someone for a cigarette, and that's very uncomfortable for me to ask them. It's bothersome. It just takes my time. So that's going to kind of make me start quitting, So I'm committing to doing something. Another example, you have to pay for a class in advance so that you're forced to attend, and there's no refunds, right? Perfect example. Otherwise, many people, if they're like, oh, you get a refund, if you show up, just pay whenever you want to. What they'll do is, today, I don't know, maybe I'll do it, and maybe I won't do it, something like that. Other people, another example would be, you're addicted to your computer, right? Like many people are. You say, you know what, I'm going to take my laptop, I'm working at home too much, I'm just going to leave my laptop at work, I'm not going to take it home with me, I have no other computer at home, so I don't use it at home. So you make a commitment in advance so that you don't back out of doing something you don't want to be doing. So what's the wisdom? He's saying basically the prohibition of riba in Islam is a pre-commitment mechanism that's built into the concept of equity-based financing. Equity-based financing is the example basically that when I sell a commodity, right, I sell an item, and I factor in the time value of the commodity, right, or the time value of the money here when I'm selling that, that's a pre-commitment mechanism that's there that's going to prevent, any type of, misuse or abuse or something that I don't want to be taking place. I'm going to get into that in a moment right now. So that's one way of explaining the prohibition on an individual level, okay? And Shaykh Umar is going to go in more detail about the idea of equity-based and commodities involved and all of that stuff. We'll go into more detail, just kind of hinting at it right now. So that is, on the individual level, a problem. One of the wisdoms we can discern. Now, if we look at it from a societal level, on a societal level, it's totally different. Its interest is going to affect the entire economy across the board. So how does it affect the entire economy? Well, first of all, we have to look at the nature of money, right? So the nature of money in Islam is that money is a means of exchange, a medium of exchange. That's what it's supposed to be. Money is not a commodity in Islam, right? It's not viewed as a commodity. So you can't sell it for a profit. Riba al-fadl, right? Gold for gold is not allowed, dates for dates not allowed. And you cannot rent it out for profit because it's not a commodity. So you can rent this. I can rent this for a year, but I could have rent this for whatever I want, but I can't rent my $10 bill and say, I'm renting this bill to you and you have to give me $15 at the end of the year. It's a rental fee. It's not a rental fee. You can't rent out a medium of exchange. Why? Number one, because there's no intrinsic utility for money. It has no actual utility in and of itself. It has no benefit in and of itself. I mean, you can make an argument, you know, if I need to blow my nose, I can use my $100 bill, right? There's some utility to it. But that does not, it's not intrinsic to the bill itself. It's not doing anything. It's just a piece of paper that's doing that, right? So it has no intrinsic utility, number one. And number two, commodities actually have different qualities intrinsically, right? This does something different, this does something different. They have different qualities. When it comes to money, what happens is money, or at least currency, is identical. Every unit is identical. Well, every unit's identical. Even currency, every unit's identical. So if you have a dirty $100 bill and a clean $100 bill, do they have different values? What if it's really dirty? What if somebody blew their nose with it? And then they wiped it off and you're like, oh my God, coronavirus, and how could you do that? And there's one perfectly clean, just came out of the mint, looks excellent, $100 bill, and it's rippled up, crumpled up. It's got like a little tiny tear here. It's got drawing on some part of it. Are they equal value? They're still considered to be equal value, right? So because of that, the nature of money is viewed as something that money is not seen as a commodity, so you can't sell it with the profit. You can't rent it out. Now, interest theory is exactly totally different. Money is not a consumption good. There's a black or white idea that came out. Money is not a consumption good that you can, utilize it for some benefit. Therefore, it must be a productive good, right? So you can use it to produce more money, right? That it should be utilized in that way. Normally, you use commodities to produce money, but you can use money to produce money. Now, Keynes' theory. There's a well-known theory in economics. It says basically money is only a medium of exchange. It's not a consumption good. It's not a production good. But that was modified, and they said, no, money can be used as a production good to produce more money. So we'll use more money to produce more money. And that's when this whole thing started changing. So currency and the concept of money started changing. So in 1905, George Knapp, he published a paper called State Theory of Money. And he made an argument for paper currency without the need for being backed by gold. All right. So prior to that, most of the paper currency, especially like in America and other places, it was backed by gold. So the dollars you had, they were mapped to gold. So he starts to make this new argument and says, you know what? We don't need currency that's backed by gold. So we got off the gold standard. In the 1930s in America, what happened? Depression. All right. The economy collapsed. People lost their jobs, people lost their houses, people lost everything. So the American government set up a committee known as the Economic Crisis Committee. And they started coming up with ideas on how we can prevent this depression from ever happening again. So one of the things that they recommended was, they said in order to ensure that money performs its true function of operating as a means of exchange and distribution, it's desirable that it should stop being traded as a commodity. The committee set up by the American government to say, hey, this depression, we don't want this to happen again. What did they say? Say, we need to get out of this model. This model helped cause the depression. We are heading in a very dangerous, direction, and we need to stop that. But of course, they didn't listen. And they continue to develop more and more and more. So what ends up happening is you look at today. You have people making money off of money, and they're making off of chances of making money, off of making more money. And if you just look at what that does, you have the global foreign exchange market today, 2019. The average daily turnover of the global foreign exchange market on a daily basis is $5.1 trillion. Okay? So a million is 6 zeros, billion is 9 zeros, right? Trillion is 12 zeros. Okay? And what's 15 zeros? No. A quadrillion. Okay? And we're coming to that. Okay? The numbers are getting there. So we're getting to quadrillion. So we're at $5.1 trillion per day is traded. Okay? 95% of those transactions are speculative. They're just kind of like, betting on, hey, this might move this way, it might move this way. There's not any actual, nothing's being produced, nothing's being sold, nothing's happening. So what you have is, this virtual financial economy. It's a virtual economy where just money is being traded back and forth based upon some speculation. What does it do? There is a real economy that exists. People are trading actual things. People produce things, right? People trade goods, services, all sorts of things. So there's a real economy and there's a virtual economy. And what does the virtual financial economy do? It completely disrupts the real economy that exists. And now you have this massive gap between the supply of money, the money supply, which I'm going to explain what that is in a moment, and the real goods that actually exist. So this is where the problem begins. And that's where the quote comes in from James Robertson. I'll read it and then I'll take your question. He has a book called Transforming Economic Life. He says, today's money and finance system is unfair, it's ecologically destructive, and it's economically inefficient. Inefficient meaning it doesn't bring the right balance within society. The money must grow imperative. So the idea is, see the dash, the hyphens there. The money must keep growing. That's the way that the economy functions now. Money has to keep on multiplying. Otherwise, the economy that's the way it works. He says that imperative drives production, and therefore it drives consumption to higher than necessary levels. It skews economic effort towards money out of money and against providing real services and goods. So there's no real services good being provided. There's money coming out of money. And he's saying it also results in a massive worldwide diversion of effort away from producing useful goods and services into making money out of money. So now rather than working somewhere where people could actually produce something that's going to benefit others, the goal is just making money out of money as much as possible, as long as you're the one who makes that money. And he says at least 95% of the billions of dollars transferred daily around the world are for purely financial transactions, unlinked to transactions in the real economy. Right? So in the real economy where things are changing, less than 5% of the economy is that. So he sets this up and he says this is a huge problem. And then you have Imam Ghazali comes along, who said this 1,000 years ago, something very similar to what James Robertson was saying. So I'll read Imam Ghazali's quote. What was your question? Okay, so 1 trillion seconds is 200,000 years. Or 146,000 years. Okay, very good. That's good. That might help you conceptualize it. A trillion seconds is 33 years? Oh, a billion is 33 years. Billion seconds is... Okay, there you go. Alhamdulillah. Very good. All right. So hopefully that helps a little bit. All right. So there you have James Robertson saying that. Then you have Imam Ghazali. Okay, he's speaking 1,000 years ago, and he's saying, look, riba is prohibited. Why? Because it prevents people from undertaking real economic activities. That's exactly what the other guy just said. I think that's exactly what's happening in our economy. There's no real economic activity. And he said this is because when a person has money, the person who has money, they're allowed to earn more money on the basis of interest. Whether it's a spot or a deferred transaction, it becomes easy for him to earn without bothering himself to take pains in real economic activities, actually producing something that people will benefit from, service or a good or whatever it is. This leads to hampering the real interests of humanity, because that cannot be safeguarded without real trade skills, industry, and construction. That actually requires some real skill to actually bring some benefit in society. So that's what riba will do. And he said that's one of the underlying reasons, macro reasons, the societal reasons why riba has been prohibited. Okay? So, you had a clarification? Yeah.
So does that mean that riba is prohibited because people won't work? Or is it because they won't produce something?
You know, when they're trading, so they won't produce something. When you're making phone calls and you're doing all these speculative transactions, you're technically working, even if it's from your living room or something, and you're making a ton of money, right? Or someone's working for you, right? So it's more about this effect on society. Okay. Now coming back to the individual level, right? On an individual level, all right, you have Islam discourages people from going into debt unless they're absolutely in need. People are not supposed to live in debt. Okay? So much so that the Prophet ﷺ, when somebody passed away and they died with debt, he would not perform the janazah for them. Like, can you imagine how serious that is? The Messenger of Allah does not want to be there for the janazah of that person. The only other person that happened, someone committed suicide. And the Prophet ﷺ said, I'm not gonna be there for the janazah. Hmm? Yeah. So the debt here, we're not talking about interest-based debt. We're talking about non-interest-based debt. Okay, the halal debt. Okay, now this doesn't mean that nobody prayed janazah on them. Okay, so janazah was prayed. They're still Muslim. Okay, they were not like the church excommunicated them. Right, but the janazah was prayed. But the Prophet ﷺ did not pray janazah. He did not want to be there. Why would he do that? Because he wanted to discourage people from following their example. He wanted to say, look, the Prophet ﷺ really didn't like this behavior. Therefore, he didn't show up for this reason as well. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that Islam is trying to teach people not to live beyond their means. Now, when it comes to interest, what is interest trying to do? Right? It just as a system, once you open that door, and you can see it clearly, it makes people more and more indebted in general. So the reason why I'm mentioning that is Islam is trying to make people less indebted. And interest is trying to make people more indebted. So just to give you one example, let me finish this and I'll take it. One example, 1963. I have an old stat here, but from the UK. 1963, the average UK household debt was about 30% of the income of people. So the amount of money that they owe was about 30% of the income that they have. Okay? In 1997, the average household debt in the UK was over 100% of the income of the average person. So they're completely indebted. So whatever they're making, they have absolutely no saving whatsoever. They owe that much money, right? So what ends up that the economy becomes structured that way, right? And if there was no riba, what would happen? Just imagine if no riba existed, and they were not able to, if all these loans that are being given out, all this debt that's being taken on, if there's no riba, what's going to happen? People are not going to, first of all, give loans for unnecessary expenses, Oh, you want to buy that big screen TV? Well, let me give you a loan for X amount of time or whatever it may be. It's not going to happen. But what's going to happen instead is you're going to have profit ventures and profit sharing and stuff. We're going to come to that in a little bit. So it would change society significantly. So Islam is trying to do one thing when it comes to debt, and interest is trying to do something else when it comes to debt. So they're moving in opposite directions. Okay? Ahmed. Mm. He is in my debt. I'm repeating this for the camera. In the voice recorder example, is he in debt to me? Yes, he's in debt to me. He owes me that money because I let the transaction be deferred. What's going to happen if he's not able to pay? That's coming soon. Okay, that's all going to come. And all the other conditions that are attached to a contract like this and how it differs from the way in which a debt would work, it's all going to be coming very soon. So we're going to get into that in a moment.
Just to be clear, debt is not haram. okay? To be clear for everyone, like whether you loan, if I loan you $100, if I loan you $100 without interest, that's permissible. If I buy the recorder and owe him $100 because of that, that's permissible. Debt itself is not haram. However, you will find in hadith upon hadith and examples from the Prophet ﷺ's lives and the companions' lives again and again and again, the discouragement of debt. The idea of living within your means, the idea of earning income, the idea of being self-sufficient, the idea of not depending upon other people, the idea of making sure you have enough money that you can support yourself and your family. There's a lot of encouragement in Islam towards being, maybe not the word independent, but at least financially independent. To be financially independent and to use that money to benefit the society, right? So Islam is not encouraging anyone to be poor. And in Islam is also not encouraging anyone to go into debt. We're trying to find a balance, right? And it's important to understand that, but the discouragement of debt is there because it could happen that you take on a loan and then you die, and then who owes that money now? You still do. So now you're dead. Yep. Yeah, if I took the digital recorder, I sold it for 25, that's fine, right? That's not the issue. The concern is even if, like the fact that I signed on for a 1-year debt in that example, that is not encouraged in Islam. Because if I could have, I mean, fine, I can sign that contract, agree to pay him $110, no, in that example it was $15, right? $15 a year from now, that's fine, it's allowed, but the fact that I owe him $15 is something that I should take very seriously. And if I can, I should try and pay that back to him tomorrow. You know, if I win the lottery, oh no, wait, lottery's haram, never mind. No, so if I come into like unexpected money somehow, right?
Compliant lottery.
Sharia compliant. Yeah, we're gonna talk about Islamic lottery. Actually, no, we're not. So if I owe him $15, it should be my goal to pay him back as soon as possible. That is the Islamic way. It's not to sit here and say, my credit cards, you know, I've charged them up. I don't know, you know, I'm just going to pay the monthly payment. That's it. And I'm going to die with a bill on my credit card. That's what the average American does. They die with bills on their credit card. And they don't feel like they owe it to anybody because they're dead. We have a day of judgment to worry about. They do too. They just don't realize it. So we need to make sure our debts are paid, because if they're not paid in this life, guess what? Where we are paying them? In the next life. You don't want to deal with that. Or like thereof. We're not going to literally pay it in cash. You're going to pay it in something way worse than that. So you don't want to be dealing with the situation of having debt. It's discouraged.
So collectively, so that was again individually. Now collectively, what are banks doing? Right now that interest, if interest is opened, what are the banks going to do? Banks are going to encourage debt. They're not going to encourage real economic activities that are supporting the community, supporting projects that are doing all this thing. They just want to make sure you got your loan. I'm going to get my money back, and I'm going to get my interest. If that business fails, if that business succeeds, if that business helps humanity, if that business harms humanity, it doesn't matter. As long as I can get my profit, that's all that matters. And that's where the injustice begins to start. Okay? So now, there's injustice potentially both ways, and banks don't see that. They don't look at it from that perspective. But let's look at this example. If a business profits, right, the bank gets no share. So a bank loans, let's say, $10 million to a company, and that company gets a 50% return. And the bank, what do they get? They get their whatever interest rate, 5%. Or 10% that they loaned it out at. They're not going to share in any of the 50%. If the 50% jumps to 500%, what does the bank get? The exact same thing. They get nothing, right? So even though they're financing the money, they're getting nothing back, okay? So now you're like, well, these banks, these big banks, you know, why should they get anything? They make all this money anyways. Now just zoom out and think about for a moment, what is a bank? What is a bank in our economy? Who puts their money in the bank? We do. Okay? So we put the money in the bank. That's our money. And the bank is going to give us what percentage of interest? 2%, 3%, something like that. And then they're going to take that money, which is our money, and they're going to loan it out to another project, another company or something, at a much higher interest rate. Right? And then that project is going to go, and they're going to go and make a bunch of, investments or something like that. And if the investments yield 500% profit, how much do you get back? You get nothing from that, right? So you don't benefit in that way at all, right? And we're going to come to this point, but I'll just mention it now. And if your average inflation rate is going to be around 3%, then what do you get? You got nothing, basically. Your money just got devalued to the extent that your money was sitting in the bank. But guess what? Because of the inflation, they're going to adjust the price of goods. So when the prices of goods are adjusted, what's going to happen? You're going to be paying the premium for the price of goods. So you ended up losing. So it's not just the person, if their business fails, that loses. You lose as well, right? So only the people completely at the top are going to be losing. Now, just imagine if you were to shift this model. Imagine, and we'll get into this later, but just imagine if you could somehow get part of the 500% profit. Imagine what that would do. Imagine how that would change things and how it would change the economy. Okay? Now, also imagine that if there's a company that's going to get 500% profit, but it's going to take 10 years for that 500%. And it's going to be an amazing project. Everything's going to be awesome. It's going to help humanity and everything. And then there's another company that's not going to make any profit at all. But the whole thing is going to be wound up within 1 year, guaranteed. The bank is going to get its money back, and they're going to get their interest. Which project is the bank going to choose to invest in? The one that's going to be helping humanity, huge projects, getting jobs, getting this, or the one that's going to have the quick money that they're going to get back? They're going to choose this one. They don't care. It makes no difference whatsoever. In fact, the whole model is designed to not be there to support anything about the people, the economy, none of that. It doesn't matter, because that's not the way their model functions. So the injustice actually potentially becomes both ways. It becomes an injustice for a project is making money and the person who supplied the money is not getting part of the return. And at the same time, you can have another type of injustice where someone's project is completely failing and they still have to pay back plus interest everything that they had borrowed. So there's an injustice that happens, and that is the underlying reason for the prohibition of riba. Now just look at how it affects the economy in many different ways. Number one, it's going to affect the resources within an economy. And we're getting to that. So how does it affect the resources in an economy? It favors the rich over the poor automatically and creates a giant gap between the two of them. How? Because who are the banks going to fund? Are they going to fund the largest cash-rich companies, or the medium businesses, or kind of like the small businesses that are maturing and venture capital and stuff like that? Who are they going to fund? The largest ones with the most cash and the quickest return for them. So what ends up happening is that the money from the wealthy people, or actually the money from you and me, is going to end up going to the wealthiest people for their projects to go. So the resources that you have, all this money could have gone to someone else who's trying to develop a good project, trying to do something, trying to make their own money, and also maybe, help society or something. That project is not going to get funded, right? So this is a problem, because the deposits are coming from the people, but the money is primarily going back to the richest of the rich. The problem number one on resources. How does it affect production? Okay, the production of goods within an economy. Now loans, when you're giving them, usually the bank wants someone who has very strong collateral. Collateral means, how do I explain collateral? Collateral is, I am giving Umar the same recorder example, right? I sold him the recorder. He owes me $15. But I'm like, you know what? What if you don't pay me the $15? So I want your watch as collateral. Just in case you don't pay it, I get to keep your watch, right? Is that an Apple Watch? Yeah. So it wouldn't work. He probably wouldn't give me that collateral for that. But that's the idea of collateral. So what would a bank want? A bank would want someone who has strong collateral so that, you know what, it doesn't matter how you use your funds. You could do whatever you want with them. All we care to make sure is we're going to get our money back. So what ends up happening is, that's one problem. The production, you have huge consumption loans that are being given to people, not for development programs. So you have an option. Let's say, for example, you have countries. We can give you a development loan, or we can give you a consumption loan, right? What options do we have? So we start thinking about it, and you say, well, you know what, which one is going to grant me a better return, right? Without making a proper assessment on any of these things, you may end up giving a giant consumption loan to get that country stuck, and we're going to see that in the next slide. So that's going to have a problem. So if you look at some of the countries in third world countries, they are spending half of their entire budget, half of their entire country budget for the year, debt servicing, which basically means that they're paying off the interest on debts that they had taken for other projects that, you know, either didn't work or didn't, you know, reach fruition or whatever it may be. So it's affecting production in a major way. The next thing is affects distribution. How does it affect distribution? Interest will affect distribution. If you think about the perspective that I gave you, right? You have people depositing their money into the bank, and then the bank is giving to these giant corporations. So you have a large project. The corporation has 10% of the money. 90% of the money is coming from the bank. It's our money, let's say. We are the people who put our money in the bank. So if they had 10% of the money, how much money did they finance from the bank? 90%. So 90% of their entire project came from our money, right? And how much percentage, if they're making a good profit, it's a solid project, and they make all this, 300% profit, how much money do we get back? No, nothing. We get nothing back. So something that they could not have even accomplished without our money, we funded 90% of it, and we get nothing out of it. That's horrible, right? So if you got the profitable, the middle class people, right, they're getting this little tiny, percentage, which ends up becoming nullified anyways. It's a huge problem because inflation, your interest, that you accumulated is gone anyways. Price of goods is increased. It's all canceled out. So what you have is, you have the rich end up having more money. Now that they have more money, they can loan more money so they can get more interest. Then you have the poor. They have to keep borrowing more money. The poorest of the poor, they have to keep borrowing more money. Why? Because they're still paying interest on the money that they had previously borrowed. And then you look at the cost of the interest repayments, right? Now it's a part of the cost of goods, because they say, well, you know what? Interest repayments that are taking place, we have to put that into the price of goods, and the price of goods changes. So this is how it affects the idea of distribution within an economy. Okay? So these are how it affects economy as a whole. Now, the next part is about money. Okay? And this is something that a lot of people don't understand. I was going to put a picture of a mint, right? Not a little candy mint that you put in there, like a mint that mints money, right? So my question was going to be, who makes money, right? That's my question to you. Who makes money? The rich, the federal government. Who makes money? Yeah. No, that's my question. Who makes money? So you're saying who prints money? Is the mint. The mint prints money. Does that mean that does the mint actually print money or not? With the push of a button, and they produce these bills. They print currency, right? Coins and all of that stuff. Now, there's a difference between currency and between money. Now, this is something that a lot of people don't know. The few people who threw the answer, they understand this, right? Other people, they don't understand this. So let me go back and tell you a story, which is most likely true, and this is how the entire thing started. Your assumption is that, let's say, there is, in the United States, I have the figure here. Where's my figure? Anyways, I'll come back to it. Let's just say in country X, Okay? There is 1 million units of money with bills. There's 1 million bills. They're all one type of bill, and there's 1 million of them floating around. And you say, that's how much of that money exists. Is that the way the economy functions? No. Okay? There's more money than currency that exists within the economy today. You say, well, wait a minute, how can that be? Because everything has to be, in the form of dollars and bills, and, it has to be in the form of some kind of currency. And the answer is, this is how it exists. So there were banks in England during the medieval period, and there were goldsmiths who would come, and they would take their money, and they had a lot of money, and they had a gold, right? So they took their gold, and they would deposit it into the bank, and in return, they would get a paper gold deposit certificate. Okay? So they get a certificate from the bank which says, you have put $1 million worth of gold inside my bank. Anytime you want it back, you come and show us this certificate, and we'll give your gold back to you. So they would go, so another goldsmith would come, put another $500,000. So here's my gold, keep it in the vault for me. Say, okay, we'll keep it in the vault. Here's your proof that you have it as well. So they would go and they would take it and they would go. So what ends up happening now is that these bankers would take that gold, and they know that most of these goldsmiths, they don't need to come and collect the gold. It's just going to sit in the bank. So they go, instead of sitting in the bank, we're going to take this and we're going to loan it out to people on interest so we can make money from it. As long as those people don't come to ask for our gold back, we're going to be okay. Everything is good. So that was working well. It was going fine. The banking system, that's how many banks were functioning, right? They're loaning it out. Everything was good. And then some of them said, you know what? We have a really good idea. You know what we can do? We have $100 million worth of gold in our vault. But you know what? These people don't even come and check on it. We gave them all these certificates. They don't even come and look at it, right? What are they going to do with the gold, right? Like Scrooge McDuck, they're going to swim around in the money vault, like what are they supposed to do? So they don't even come. So they won't even know. Let's just do something secretly on the side. What we'll do is we'll just give extra loans to people and say, you know what? Okay, because when people would come for loans, they weren't even just taking the gold, they were taking a gold certificate, and they started trading in these gold certificates. So they say, you know what we're going to do? We're going to start loaning out more money than we have in the vault, because people are not collecting it. So we have $100 million in the vault. We're going to loan out $200 million. And if someone comes to collect it, they're not all going to come at the same time. So we can just come and say, look, you have your certificate, don't worry, we give another certificate to someone else. So they started loaning more money than actually existed in their vault. And this was cheating, right? This was something which was not supposed to happen. And when they got caught, or if they got caught, they're in big trouble. So what happens? Someone later on, this fraudulent practice, later on in the economy, during the modern period, someone comes up and says, let's develop a fractional reserve system where we do this on purpose, where what we can do is, however much money exists in a bank, they're allowed to actually loan out 10 times the money. So if you have $100 million in your vault, you can loan out how much money? Which is what? Oh, too much. $1 billion, right? Yeah. $1 billion, assuming that, you know what, at least you have 10%. Just don't go over that threshold. Don't go over 10 times, and we're good to go. And that's a fractional reserve system. So basically what happens now is, we say, how can you loan out money that doesn't exist? That doesn't make sense. How that money doesn't actually exist. There's only $100 million of actual money sitting in the vault. So what we're going to do, every time we give a loan, we're going to consider that to be a creation of money. So money gets created in a register. So the moment I make that loan, right, for another 100 million to somebody else, I'm only at 20% of my threshold. That money has just been created by me in a register, and now the money exists in the economy. Okay? So that's what actually happens today. That's how our economy functions. And a lot of people don't understand that. So when you go and you put your money in the bank, hypothetical scenario, this is kind of how it works, not exactly, but kind of. You put $100 in the bank, Bank of America. Bank of America goes, well, thank you very much. I'm very glad you You enjoyed our coffee, usually cheap coffee in the banks anyways, right? Thank you, you enjoyed our coffee and, you came and put your money. Now, we can create $1,000 because you put your $100 into our bank, and we're going to go and loan $1,000 out to somebody, to a bunch of different people because of your $100. And don't worry, when you come to claim it, hopefully, you don't come too quickly, right? And you don't try and take all your money out, right? We'll be able to somehow figure out a way to get you your $100 back if you need it. Yes. Yeah. I'm just giving you an example so people get it. Yes. And the Federal Reserve Bank is it sounds really governmental, right? It's like, well, it's Federal Reserve Bank. So it's a governmental organization? It's a non-profit organization? It's a public organization, at least belongs, United Nations regulated organization? It's a private, for-profit owned corporation. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Yes, exactly. An individual does it, it's a Ponzi scheme. Exactly. Yes. We'll come back to that because it'll take us off topic. So I want to get through this and then we'll come back to it, inshallah. So this is kind of how the entire system works. This system could not work if there was no riba, right? Money would have to be equivalent to the actual money that exists, not money that doesn't exist, right? So this became the standard way, right? So if you look at the percentage, all the bills, all the coins that we have, it's a little tiny proportion of the money that actually exists within anyone's economy. Let's take the UK as an example. 1977, 12% of the entire money supply in 1997 was real money, like currency, actually, like in actual form. So it was real money or some kind of asset backed or something like that. In 1997, it was 3.6%. Okay? So it just keeps on going down. So what's going to 3.6%? Yeah. So what ends up happening is it'll just keep going down. The real money that exists within the economy is just going to simply keep going down, because while money more and more artificial, or we could say virtual money, say virtual money is being created. Okay, so people got all scared about Bitcoin and when it came out and cryptocurrency. It's not real money. It's not this. It's not that. None of your money is real. Okay, none of the money was real in the first place, right? If you understand how it really works, it's all virtual anyways, right? So when we understand that, what's happening? You have in the UK, for example, this is 1997. So 96.4% is just this artificial bubble, right? That's why it's called a bubble, because it's big, but it's so fragile, it can just pop very quickly. So it's artificial bubble that's created by who? It's by the banks, okay? Now the banks, they're not creating currency. They're creating checkbook money or deposits by making loans. Every time they make a loan, they're able to create 90% more of that money, which means that the banks are responsible for over 90% of the inflation that happens in an economy. So you say inflation happens, things are getting expensive, that's just the way the world works, it has to do with buying and selling and trade. No, over 90% of inflation is due to the interest-based economy. You would not have that level of inflation if you didn't have an interest-based economy, right? So what they do, they say, well, we can control the interest rate, right? So the government will come, temporary solution, will lower interest rates to encourage people to borrow more money. So the interest rate goes down, they're going to borrow more money. What ends up happening when you're borrowing more money? You're creating more money, or you're reducing the money supply? You're creating more money. So more money is being created. The economy grows. All right? What's the side effect? The side effect when you lower that interest rate, people who have debt, they're going to be hit with interest charges, extra charges here. It leads to injustice, leads to homes being repossessed, leads to businesses becoming bankrupt, all of these things, right? So you're going to discourage borrowing when there's a recession. And then they're going to wait for consumer confidence to kick in. And then they're going to start saying, oh, well, we're going to lower it again to encourage borrowing. So what ends up happening is you have these cycles. And these cycles will continue and continue over a period of time. Now if that wasn't bad enough, what becomes worse now is the concept of this debt money is one thing. So what is debt money that we're talking? This is what our money is today. A debt money is a claim. When you have a claim over money, it counts as money. So what is a bank loan? Say, you know what? You owe me this much money, so we count it as money. We created a loan, and the loan equals money. That's the way it works. Now afterwards, derivatives got created. And we're not going to go through what derivatives are and how they work. It has to do with, speculative transactions. And what a derivative basically is, it's a claim over a claim counting as money. So it's just one more step away from something being real, right? So if currency is real and money is not real, derivatives are not real, right? They're one step further away. Now, if you look at the derivatives market, okay, the 2017, the world GDP, the gross domestic product, of the entire world, what the economy is producing, is $80 trillion. Okay, $80 trillion approximately. What is the world derivatives market? $1.2 quadrillion. Okay, so that's more than 10 times the GDP of the entire world is actually in something which is not real. Okay, and how does that affect? This affects the entire economy significantly. Like we said, the virtual economy is going to affect the real economy. So the real people who are producing real services, offering real things, producing something of actual real value, are going to be affected by the people who are making this giant virtual economy. And that's where people lose their jobs and they lose their businesses and they lose all sorts of things. Yeah, last 2 points and then we'll break, inshallah. So what ends up happening here is this has a huge effect on the entire world. So they say, well, what we can do is we're going to give the financial system the power to rule the economy. So they get to decide how the economy is going to be adjusted. They get to decide when there's going to be economic downturn, what we're going to shift this way, the interest rates are going to be. So when they're given power because of interest. If interest was cut, then their power would be cut, and their power would be reallocated to someone who will actually make decisions which are actually for the good of the economy, not just for the good of the people who are trying to get the maximum amount of money in that sense, right? So if you look at it from this perspective, we talked about history, we talked about interest in the past, and how Buddhists, Hindus, Greeks, Romans, Jews, Christians, Muslims, everyone across most people, right, who use their mind, they said interest is a really, really bad thing, right? Like Cato, it's like murder. If interest was bad back then, this type of interest is on a totally different level of being bad. And yet many people just can't see it because they don't understand it. Okay? Yeah, hopefully 12:50 inshallah. Yeah. Okay, inshallah. We will resume. Inshallah. All right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Wa ba'd. So, the overall effect on the poor, as you can see, is going to be very significant. If you look at even the development loans that exist from the IMF, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, that are given to all of those countries, what you find is, you find three phases that generally happen. First, you have these countries called the developing nations. They're getting these development loans. And there's restrictions, and they have to be done for development projects, right? So they take those loans for development projects, and they start working on them. And then the next stage, once they start taking those loans, then they start taking non-development loans. Say, you know what, well, my palace, needs some marble, in its floor, and, I need such and such, our fleet of Mercedes, needs to be upgraded and stuff like that. It's not a development loan. So they start taking these consumption loans. That's stage 2. And then stage 3, what ends up happening is then they can't pay off those loans. So now they're taking loans to pay off the interest that they have to pay on the previous loans that they had taken. And this is a cycle that just continues over and over again. And there's a lot of data on this. I'm gonna skip some of these points that I have, but the data on this is so clear. You look at sub-Saharan Africa, for example. Between 1982 and 1990, you look at all of the development loans that were given to them to help their country, and what do you find? You find that the people were, as a whole, as an entire group, we're not just talking one country, we're talking about as an entire group, all of them, across the board, they're more in debt, and they're more poor after 1 decade from all the development loans that were there, right? To say that, oh, well, it must be their fault, they didn't, develop properly, or something like that. This doesn't make sense. This is problem number 1. Problem number 2 is when those projects fail, and they say, you know what, these development loans didn't work, who are they going to blame? They're going to blame the country. Well, your development projects, you were going to build this giant water, desalination plant to bring clean water to your people. We gave you all this money. We tried to give you a pretty good interest rate too. We wanted to help you build your country and get your people out of problems, but you guys just didn't manage the project properly. The problem was with you guys, actually. So what we're going to do? We're going to have to do what's called structural readjustment or structural adjustment. What is structural adjustment? Well, we, as the people who control the loans and the economy, we're going to come in and we're going to come and supervise your entire economy of the whole country, right? And we're going to start determining what the interest rate should be. We're going to manipulate your entire economy since we're not capable of doing it yourself. So now, the people who had given the loans, they will come and actually take over the entire economy of a foreign country and make all decisions. And they say, well, we have to do this because we're not going to get our principal back. So we have no choice but to basically take over your country. Why? Because we need our money back. That's the only reason. We tried to help you. You guys just couldn't help yourselves. So now we just have to take over your country. And we're just getting our money back, and then we'll be gone. Right? And when that fails, and they say, we took over your economy, we didn't want to harm you so much. So when that fails, you know what we're going to have to do? We're going to have to implement some austerity measures, right? Like what's happening in Greece and Italy recently. We're going to have to implement austerity programs. So your social services that are there, we're going to have to cut them. Your education programs, we're going to have to cut that too. So we can get our interest back on the loans and maybe a little part of our original loan that we had given you. So not only have we taken over your entire economy, we're going to cut all the social services in the economy so that we make sure that we're getting what we need. So what ends up happening? The development loan ends up at the end. Basically, people are more poor, they have less social services, less people are enrolled in school because all the education budget was cut, and there's no development taking place on any major significant way. So if you just look at the World Bank itself, they had a 1989 review. According to their own data, they themselves are saying, they were asked, can you point one project, just one project, this is a United Nations World Bank, can you show us one project where displaced people had been relocated and rehabilitated to a similar standard of living that they had before? Can you just show one example? And they said, well, no, not really. We didn't really achieve any of those things. We couldn't do any of those things. But they still made their money at the end of the day, right? So that is where all of these problems come, okay? So, this becomes a huge issue. It's your turn.
Okay. So we've heard Sheikh Mustafa talk a lot this morning about riba, and he's been destroying it and talking about how bad it is. But I want to have some counterpoints. So, you talked about riba as being prohibited. You said third Hijri and all this stuff. But isn't there like a hadith in Sahih Bukhari where Ibn Abbas talks about the fact that riba was prohibited in the last year when the Prophet ﷺ was going to die, and the last verse to be revealed was the verse about riba. And then Umar radiallahu anhu, he said that the Prophet ﷺ died before he could explain some things about riba. So I don't know, like, can you maybe explain, because it sounds like you're saying all these, but is riba actually, like, do we even understand what it really is? Because there seems to be some evidence that maybe we don't completely understand what it is.
So this is there. This is an argument that people do make. But before I even address your argument, right? And I know you're probably going to come with more arguments as well, right? But before even addressing this argument, people have made arguments. But when it comes to riba in Islam, this is something that is known to be ijma'. Ijma' means there's a unanimous consensus across every single scholar that has ever lived, right? So these arguments you're throwing out, I will respond to them, right? But keep in mind, these are not genuine arguments that were actually made by anyone who's like a recognized scholar who's, this is an opinion that's respectable, there's some difference of opinion on the issue. This is just people have thrown this out, and it's worthy of being responded to. So yeah, you said riba was prohibited in the last year, okay? So remember I had 3 verses on the, I showed you 3 verses of the Quran. The really long one, right, was revealed near the end of the lifetime of the Prophet, peace be upon him, near the end of the revelation. But if you go back and you remember that I mentioned that the first verse, which actually came down to prohibit riba, was revealed during which period? 3rd year, near the Battle of Uhud, right? So that part is pretty clear, number 1, right? Number 2, you have this idea that, someone, Abdullah ibn Abbas, he came along and he said the last verse of the Quran that was revealed was the verse of riba, right? And he didn't actually mean that. What he meant was, according to the vast majority of scholars, the last verse of the Quran was revealed was verse 281 of Surah Al-Baqarah, right? 281. So what are the verses of riba that we saw? 275 to 280. And the last verse, 281, is connected directly to those. So most probably when Ibn Abbas made this statement, he was just referring to, look, it's in the same order, right? It's like right after the verses of riba, and you need a label to kind of identify what that verse is. So they're talking about the exact same thing. This does not mean that, there's a misconception to say that, riba was not prohibited, and like the last verse that came down to the Prophet ﷺ was, oh, by the way, riba is haram. And then a few days later, he passes away. This is not the way it worked, okay? Riba was prohibited much earlier, and none of the companions are making this argument. So this is a kind of twisting of words when it comes to what argument they're actually making, right? And, sometimes there's people who say that Umar, radiallahu anh, he made a statement which is in Bukhari. It's in Bukhari and Muslim, where he said, there was 3 things I wish that the Prophet, peace be upon him, he clarified more for us. He explained more before he passed away. Number 1, inheritance of the grandfather. Number 2, inheritance of someone who has no father, no parents and no children. And number 3, some issues about interest, right? So I said, yeah, that hadith is there. So what does Umar mean? Could Umar possibly have meant that, the Prophet did not explain interest, and it's unclear, it doesn't make sense, we don't understand what riba is, and we can't even define it. We needed to ask him, and he passed away. That is a complete misunderstanding of this text. What's really happening is he's talking about riba al-fadl, that hadith about dates for dates and salt for salt. And we talked about how scholars even differed about well, is it by weight? Is it only these 6 things? Is it because they're measurable? What's the issue there? He had some questions about some types of riba, primarily referring to riba al-fadl, not what riba means as a whole concept. That's not what he was talking about. So That's a response to that argument. Hopefully that clarifies that.
The-
Is that a yes?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, in fact, it's pretty well known, like those verses of Baqarah. Only that last verse over there, I think 281, that's the only one that Ibn Abbas was referring to, and that's actually very well known. And in fact, that verse wasn't even put up on the slide. So what the like that last part, that last verse wasn't even on the slide. It's just it's talking about fearing Allah, and it comes right after riba. That's the verse. Okay, the second argument I've got for you is that isn't riba really only just referring to, you know, you loan someone money and then you didn't charge them interest and they didn't give it back to you on time. So then initially you didn't say you were going to charge interest and you just gave them a loan, and now it's time due and now you're saying, hey, I'm going to charge you interest. So it wasn't something you agreed to up front, it's something you came in with later. Isn't that what riba is? Like, isn't like normal interest okay?
So that's an interesting idea, okay? But just a very simple answer to that is that if someone did not initially put a rate of interest, does that mean it's a goodwill loan, like from the beginning? They're not going to specify what it is. Like, why would you take a loan and you're like, well, I have no idea what's going to happen afterwards, right? I'm not sure what the rate is going to be later on. If I can't pay it, then something's going to happen. And it's going to be like some amount, and I have no idea what the amount's going to be. It could be 5%, it could be 100%, it could be, you know, South Dakota, it's going to be like 1,000,000%. I have no idea what's going to happen, right? That doesn't even make sense. No one would be doing that. And it would mean that the original person is giving like a goodwill loan for like a year, and then all of a sudden, if you can't pay it back, he's going to kick in. Interest-based loans were never for goodwill. They always had a stipulated rate of interest that was happening. So what happens is that people are confusing 2 points. So there's always a rate of interest in the beginning. This is the way it worked. It's very clear. Many scholars, Razi, Jassas, they clarified this point. This is how riba worked even in Arabia, and everyone knew in all the other societies riba worked the same way. You stipulate what the interest rate is going to be when you're taking the loan. There's no one today, just think about today. Would you go to someone and say, I'm going to take a loan from you? And you say, what's the rate of interest? And we'll talk about it, you know, when it happens. You know, it doesn't work that way. So there's always going to be a rate of interest. But when they're unable to pay, there would be a default. They would renegotiate and say, well, give me this much extra money for more time. And it would become renegotiated at that point in time. So, which is with the same thing that happened. So it was happening on both sides. Interest was specified in the beginning, and more interest was being added at the end in case of default. No. No, it's not. No, we're not talking about that's right now we're talking about loaning money. Only loaning money.
Okay, third argument. So if the if the reason for prohibition of riba is that you're doing injustice, you're doing oppression, you're doing zulm upon the poor, right? So you shouldn't obviously like loan money to the poor and then charge them interest on it. But banks, they're not poor. They, you know, they're giving loans out, and they're not exploiting people. Like, what if I just want to go get a loan from the bank? I don't feel like I'm getting exploited, and I'm going to use that to build something. You know, it's going to be useful and beneficial to society. I'm going to build a hotel or, you know, a masjid, you know, something like that. It's going to be beneficial. I'm not being exploited. Isn't that okay? Like, why is that still a problem? I'm not exploiting the poor, and I'm building something useful.
So yeah, that's a very common argument, is that, you know, riba is only prohibited because it exploits the poor. And this is a misunderstanding, right? It's a misunderstanding for a few reasons. Number one is because, yes, exploitation of the poor is one of the wisdoms behind why it's prohibited, but it's not the only wisdom, right? So we talked about injustice can actually end up being both ways, right? So that's problem number one. Problem number two, when something is forbidden as a transaction, does it matter whether you're poor or whether you're rich? So let's say I say, you know what? Hey, you know, you seem pretty wealthy, and it's okay if you lose money. So I'm going to open a casino, I'm going to invite you in. Why don't we only allow rich people into our casino, right? So technically we're exploiting them the same way we would be, collecting interest from them when we're owning a casino and owning a gambling house. But we're not going to allow any poor people inside. No poor people allowed to play the lottery. No middle class people allowed to play the lottery. Only rich people are allowed inside. Would it be okay then? No, because when you're forbidding a transaction, you don't care what the financial status of the person is. It's about what type of problem is there in the transaction itself. So when we explain what does riba do and why is it problematic, it doesn't matter if the person is rich, if they're middle class, if they're poor, that you shouldn't be doing that. How about like bribing someone, Is it okay to bribe rich people? So they already have money. Is it okay to bribe poor people? Well, they could utilize some of the money, right? Maybe there's justice in bribing poor people. At least they get some money, right? So is there any difference between bribing a poor person, a middle class person, and a rich person? So one is halal, one is haram. They're all in the same category. Bribing as an act is a problem. Gambling as an act is a problem. Engaging in riba as an act is a problem. It doesn't matter who it's going to or where it's, where the money is going or something like that. It's the transaction itself. And the other thing is, this falsely assumes that, there were no such thing as consumption or productive loans, right? Like loans were not for productive reasons. There were no business loans. Loans were just for the poor, right, in the past. That's not the case. Anyone who studies history realizes that the loans that were given throughout history, many of them were productive loans. They were loans for, financing an army. They were loans for financing a caravan, trying to make more money out of it. They were loans to wealthy people. And the loans to wealthy people were condemned, right? So even in Roman society, even in the Greeks, there were loans that were being given to the rich are still falling in the category of usury, and they're still being condemned because it's the transaction which is condemned, not the person's status or the amount of wealth that they have, right? So just because someone's rich doesn't mean it's like, it's okay to, exploit them, right? Because it's not a big deal, I'm not exploiting them. No, the transaction is exploitative and it shouldn't exist. Yeah. We're super summarizing what we had here.
I mean, just because someone's rich doesn't mean you can steal from them, right? So it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. We can all see why stealing's bad. So just because they're rich doesn't mean we can cheat them from a portion or do some injustice. Okay, the next argument I have, that we have, is that, the Quran says, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا تَأْكُلُوا رِبَا أَضْعَافًا مُضَاعَفًا, right? So the Quran is saying, don't deal with interest multiplied and multiplied. So what if we're just dealing with simple interest, not exploitative and not like charging and charging and charging more, but just saying, give you $100, give me 115 back next year. Not like compound interest, just simple interest. Isn't that okay? Because the Quran seems to be very clear, right? يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا تَأْكُلُوا رِبَا أَضْعَافًا مُضَاعَفًا.
So this is an interesting argument as well, is that if you look at that verse in Al Imran, it's saying multiplied over and over, أضعافا مضاعفة. It's mentioning that as a description, but it's not mentioning that as the reason for the prohibition of interest. So it's very important to differentiate between a few things. So number one, first of all, this idea of compound interest, right? Versus simple interest. Which one is the Quran referring to? Well, let's go back to Surah Al-Baqarah, right? So there's 3 verses on interest. Mainly 2. One talks about the Jews. So there's 2 sections on interest in the Quran. Whenever you're looking at any topic in the Quran, you should look at the topic comprehensively by looking at all the verses on that subject. So if you want to, for example, you want to understand what is the story of Prophet Adam and Iblis in the garden, and what happened to Adam and ate from the tree and all of that stuff. The story of Adam is not 1 or 2 or 3 places in the Quran. It's more than that. More than 3, I forgot what it was, but it's more than 3 places in the Quran. So what do? You'd be like, no, I'm only going to check Surah Al-Baqarah. I'm going to get the whole story from here. The other story doesn't exist. That's not the way we look at it. The way we do is we look at every single instance of the story of Adam in the Quran, anywhere in the Quran, and Hadith too, but let's just stick with Quran, right? And we compile all of those verses about Adam, and then we piece together the story, and we get the entire story. Because the whole story is not mentioned in just one part of the Quran. There's different pieces and parts mentioned. Same thing with the story of Prophet Musa. Different parts of the story of Prophet Musa are mentioned in different places. Likewise, when it comes to riba, we don't just take one verse. We say we're only going to interpret this verse. We take every single verse about riba, put them together, and understand them together. So if we do that, which is what we did, we looked at all the verses, what do we find? What does Allah say in Surah Al-Baqarah? وَذَرُوا مَا بَقِيَ مِنَ الرِّبَا, and give up whatever remains. Ma baqiya min al-riba. Ma means any amount. It's small amounts need to be given up to, right? So this idea, it says you are entitled to your lakum ru'usu amwalikum. You are entitled to your principal. You get that back. You're not entitled to 1 cent on top of that. So this concept of what amount of riba and compound versus simple interest, whatever it may be, where's the basis for that? This is not what this verse is saying, because you have to understand all verses within the context of other verses. So then you may say, well, you know, what's the point of saying this then? Why would Allah mention multiplied over and over when it's talking about, you know, consuming interest? What's the reason for it? Actually, wait, we're on number here. So what's the reason for it, right? There's got to be some reasoning behind it. Well, it's the language, right? It's not a restriction, because Islam is not a legal language. The Quran is not a legal language. The Quran doesn't speak in legal terms, right? It's emphasizing that, you know what? If the rate is compounded, it's even worse, right? But if it's not compounded, it's still bad. So let's take an example. Allah says in Surah Al-Baqarah, He says, وَلَا تَشْتَرُوا بِآيَاتِي ثَمَنًا قَلِيلًا. Do not sell my verses, right? My scripture. Do not sell my verses for a small price. Right? So does that mean that it's okay we sell it for a high price? This Allah was criticizing the Jews and saying, do not sell my verses which I've revealed to you. Don't sell it for some petty gain. So it's okay if you sell it for a good gain, right? So as long as you're making a good profit when you're selling the book of Allah, you know, and you're disregarding it, then it would be okay. That's not what Allah means. That's not what He means. We're not going to take it literally, right? The problem is not the price. The problem is selling the verses of Allah, right? Selling meaning like you're changing it for a little bit of material gain, right? The problem is changing or selling, and the wording is selling the verses of Allah for material gain. It's not the material gain or how much you get. It's the selling part that's the problem, right? Same thing when it comes to riba. So hopefully that makes it clear. And even if it was, right, Allah would have to specify what the rate would be. Allah would have to specify what is the rate that's exploitation. Is it 50%? Is it 20%? Even the states specify, except those three, right? Even the states have specifications. If Allah was prohibiting and saying, this is not allowed, what would that percentage be? What is al-du'afa muda'afa? What does that mean? Does it mean 200%? Does it mean 300%? 400%? Would that even make any sense? That Allah is going to say, you know what? 200 to 400% interest rates are not allowed. Anything else besides that, we're good to go. That would be in contradiction to everything that exists in like the entire history. All the things that the Jews have been charging interest on, that they're being criticized for, their definition of what riba is, definition of Catholics, definition of what usury and riba is. It wouldn't make any sense if we understood it that way. That's why no scholar ever understood it that way. What's that? Oh yeah, how many times am I allowed to stab someone? Yes.
So the question was, is there a context? Why did Allah say ad'afa muda'afa? So first of all, I just want to remind everyone what Shaykh Mustafa said, is Quran has a certain style. a lot of that style comes from the Arabic language and the Arabic culture at the time. And for us just to translate some words and say like, oh, let's interpret them in the modern English language in the year 2020, it becomes very problematic. That's where we end up misinterpreting things like verses of hijab. We're like, oh, if I look that word up in the dictionary now, that's what it means. No, look that word up in the Arabic dictionary of what it meant 1400 years ago, right? And what people understood it as. So it's very important to understand the Quran was revealed at a time, at a place, in a culture, right? And so we need to interpret it from that language, that time, and that culture. Otherwise, we will completely misunderstand the Quran. If we go look up every word in the Quran in the dictionary, we're going to get a different meaning, right? And I don't want to get into details of tafsir, but that's the problem that happens. Having said that, it's very important to understand the وَلَا تَشْتَرُوا بِآيَاتِي ثَمَنًا قَلِيلًا analogy, right? So al-'afa mud'afa it could just mean like you're multiplying your money. It could mean simple interest. You loan your money out, you get principal and interest back. You loan it out a second time, and you get principal and interest back. You do that third time, fourth time. You become lazy. This becomes your way of making money, okay? That is one explanation of the verse. It could be very simple. Another explanation of the verse could be that it means compound interest, right? And I think for those that understand compound interest, the idea is instead of like you paying a percentage every year, it's compounded maybe monthly. And so you end up paying a little bit more, or it's maybe compounded weekly or daily, or now the fancy term is compounded instantly. The difference between daily and instant really isn't much of a difference. It's more of a marketing thing. So if you're putting your money in the bank account, the bank will be like, I will give you instant compounding. Okay, big deal. It just gives you a little bit more money, okay? So that is another explanation for the verse, is it means compound interest. A third explanation that the scholars of tafsir and the scholars of fiqh have given on this is that there was a time when the exploitation, they call it riba al-jahiliyyah. Okay, so we talked about riba al-fadl, we talked about riba nasi'a. Riba al-jahiliyyah, there was a time when the compounding of the interest or the exploitation of interest was done in an extremely exploitative state. I don't know if that even makes sense. Loan sharking, yeah. So you say like, oh, you didn't give me the money back, I'm going to like double the interest on you. Or you didn't give me the money back, I'm going to compound it this way, or some other exploitative, if that's a word, mechanism. So the scholars have interpreted this multiple ways, and all those ways are really fine, but I think the important point to understand is the language of the Quran, and all of these explanations are possible, but all of these explanations actually work together. So what the Quran is trying to say is prohibit all of them together, just like the thaman and qalila, right? There's no thaman and kathira or something like that that's allowed, right? Okay. Okay, so I think we've talked a lot about this. Did you have a related question? Yeah. Yes. The question was, all of the verses that we talked about in the Quran are talking about making money from interest. What if you're not making? What if you're giving money? So what if you're on the opposite side of the transaction? You're not actually consuming any interest, but you're letting someone else consume the interest. That's the question. The answer is in the Quran, no, we don't have a direct verse on this concept. But the hadith that Shaykh Mustafa mentioned, it said anyone who consumes interest, gives interest, witnesses interest, all of that, writes up a contract with interest, that is included in that hadith. So, I mean, again, in our religion, we don't need to have, not everything is spelled out in the Quran, right? We were sent a messenger, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to interpret the Quran and teach it to us as a role model. And so we take, whether he taught it to us or it comes from the Quran, we take both at the same level of in terms of once you've authenticated that he did something like that, it's given the same level of, what's the right word? Authority, whether it's Quran or it's Sunnah, right? We don't differentiate between authority. When the Prophet ﷺ says something is not allowed, we don't say, well, he's not Allah. We don't say that. We know he's the messenger of Allah, and we know that he's communicating the message from Allah. So we follow that the same way. And you can logically derive that, like the issues of riba. You can logically derive that from the Quran as well, just from common sense. So okay, fine, riba's bad. We shouldn't do that. It has all these destructive elements, but we live in the real world, right? And we have to deal with the real world. So that's the part that I'm kind of concerned about, and I'm going to spend most of the second weekend talking about, is how do we deal with this in the real world? So my struggle here is capitalism permissible, right? We're living in this world. I think we all have bank accounts. Anyone not have a bank account? We all have bank accounts. Many of us have credit cards. We work for companies, all of these things, right? And what Shaykh Mustafa is saying is, he's like kind of destroying almost like the world we live in. How do we live in this world? Anyone who studied economics, again, you've studied the 4 factors of production, right? They talk about in capitalism, you have land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur. This is just one of the, I don't know, chapter 1 or chapter 2 of economics. You go through limited resources and you get into like factors of production. So factors of production are the things that you need to make useful things. So they say land, some sort of land. You're like, no, we have services companies now. You know, Facebook, Amazon, they don't need, yeah, they do. They have distribution centers, they have data centers. Everything needs land of some sort. You need labor, you need people to participate. You need an entrepreneur, somebody who's going to run a business, otherwise you're not going to have a business. And then you need capital. The definition of capital in capitalism primarily is money. If you don't have money, how do you buy machines? If you don't have money, how do you make anything happen, right? So if we're not going to have banks and we're not going to be able to get money, then how can we have businesses and how can anything really happen? Fractional reserve, right? The whole system is based on this interest-based system. So if we get rid of that, how do we live in this world, right? So I don't know, like one option we have, because I'm kind of struggling here, is I don't know how to fix this, right? So we could just say, skip the second weekend, right? We just skip the second weekend and say, we don't really have an answer here because Shaykh Mustafa is making this very hard. So, you know, maybe we should all just, you know, start our own farms, become cavemen, cave persons, just like grow our own vegetables, right? And raise our own cows. And then that way we don't have to like deal with riba, right? So we just avoid this whole thing because we certainly can't live in California, right? Like I don't know. So let's just like grow our own farms and like do this thing because this is just like seeming really hard. Or, you know what, like for those of us that have studied some Islamic law, right? There's this concept in Islamic law called darura, necessity, right? And so, for example, if you're starving and you have nothing else to eat except pork, are you allowed to eat that? Everybody familiar with that concept of necessity? Is if you are about to starve to death, you're actually allowed to take the haram and you're allowed to eat it. Right? So you can eat pork. You're allowed to drink alcohol at that point in time. You're allowed to do certain things that you wouldn't be able to do. So what I don't understand, maybe this is my final argument to you for the day, is like it doesn't, like all this stuff that you've mentioned seems like it's just going to kill the business. Like everything becomes charities and all this stuff. So we can't have a world like that. So can we instead justify riba and say it's necessary for us to live? The times have changed. Times have changed. The place has changed. The economy has changed. Let's justify it based on necessity.
So as they say, if there's a will, there's a way, right? So the thing is, if we utilize our minds a little bit, we utilize, you know, our technology a little bit, we can come up with a solution to these problems. It's not that it's not possible. It is possible. So I don't think we need to resort to this idea of necessity. And we have some precedents of people who've actually figured out a way to be able to make living without interest a little bit more feasible, right? So we don't need to be sitting there and saying, it's like, you know, we're starving and dying and we must eat pork. So let me give you 2 examples, okay? What's the alternative? One alternative could be interest-free micro-lending, right? If you look at Kickstarter, you look at Kiva, what you'll find is that they're going and they're giving money to Kickstarter, for example. They're going to be giving money to these small businesses that have these ideas, or entrepreneurs that have these ideas that they want to get started, and everyone is pitching in. And if you have an interest-free option of micro-lending, what you can actually do is you can stimulate those projects and you can get them off the ground. And there's many projects that started that way, right? And they were very successful, right? So I was mentioning earlier about your watch, which happens to be the same as my watch, similar to my watch. But prior to the Apple Watch, what was the watch that used to work with the iPhone? The Pebble, right? And how was that started, right? How did it come about? It was like it was a Kickstarter campaign or another platform? It was Kickstarter or another platform. I forgot what it was, but it was an amazing watch. It worked really well. You had one. I had one as well, right? Did anyone else have a Pebble? We're the only ones who have, Yeah, you guys really should, Okay. Anyways, so it was a fantastic watch. Actually, I missed it. There were some features in there that was just really amazing, like not having to charge it every single night, right? But it was one of the most successful projects on Kickstarter, right? So you have examples like that, and if Muslims put their minds to it, they can actually have interest-free micro lending taking place, small levels. Everyone donates. Let's say someone comes up with a project. I want to, develop a new machine. It's going to cost me $100,000. Say, okay, we're going to get 100 people, invest $1,000 each. Say, I'm willing to do that. It's a really good project. The way you did it, it's going to maybe potentially make some money later on. I'm going to go ahead and give you the loan here. If you can produce it, then, great. So that's one option, okay? There's another option that even before technology, there is a bank known as JAK Bank, right? How many, and this is not like just kidding bank, okay? This is, Jazakallah khair, it's not Jazakallah khair bank, okay? So how many of you have heard of JAK Bank? Anybody? Nobody's heard of JAK Bank. Okay. Can you guess what country it's from?
Good guess.
Malaysia? Malaysia. Indonesia? No. Singapore, you're close. You're very close. Singapore's close. Bangladesh? No. Brunei? No. You're only close to Singapore because you had the S, the letter S, right? See, the problem where you're getting it wrong is that it's not a Muslim country. All right? Closer, much closer. Huh? Sweden, there you go. It's Sweden, right? So JAK Bank is a bank in Sweden, and it basically stands for the Land Labor Capital Members Bank, okay? And what happened was it's a cooperative financial institution. So let me tell you what happened, right? Right now, they have 39,000 members as of 2015. They have branches in Denmark, branches in Germany, branches in Italy, and there is absolutely no interest involved in this bank whatsoever. And they give out loans interest-free, and you can keep your money in there interest-free. Okay, now how does that work? And why does it work? Okay, the way that it works is that loans are only given to members of the bank who have, there's a savings point system, basically. So you put your money in the bank, and you're getting points for keeping your money there. And you're allowed to take a loan to the same amount of time that you had allowed your money to be loaned to other members. So as long as your money is being used to be loaned to other members, you rack up points. Whenever you're ready to redeem your points, you're not allowed to take the same kind of loan with those kind of points so that you can go ahead. And if you needed to, if you overdrew a little bit, you have after savings commitment, where you need to kind of refill that payment afterwards back into the bank. Kind of like what a continuous charity does for financing education, nowadays over here. So when did this concept arise? It seems like pretty new, right? Like kind of like Kickstarter's pretty new. JAK Bank was founded in 1931, okay, in Denmark. Why? It was founded during the Great Depression. Because there was a group of people there, they realized, you know what the problem of the Great Depression is? It's interest. And we need to get out of this cycle. And it's going to keep happening again and again, and we don't accept this. So what did they do? They did a number of things. Number one, they issued their own local currency. That's supposed to be like a real currency alternative in Denmark. All right? Great idea, because currency lost its value, right? So they said, we're going to make a real currency. So within 2 years, Denmark banned it and shut the currency down. You're not allowed to do that. Only our fake currency has value. Your currency is not going to be allowed to exist. Then they established an interest-free savings and loan system and a local exchange trading system. Denmark shut those down as well. Like, no, you're not going to start like this little interest-free model within our country. It's not going to work, right? So Denmark goes, we're not having that. But the philosophy remained. So the philosophy was, look, economic instability is due to interest. That's what caused these depressions and these recessions. It's going to move money from the poor to the rich, and it's going to primarily favor high-yield, short-term projects. And it's going to neglect all the lower-yield, long-term projects. And they said, this is bad for our economy. This is bad for our people. We don't want that. So what happened was they tried many times Denmark shut them down. We're not going to allow it. So in 1965, in Sweden, the same group starts a non-profit organization called the National Association for Economic Emancipation. Emancipation, like slavery. They're saying we're in debt slavery. We need to get out of this slavery somehow. We got to do something about it. And these are not Muslims. These are not religious people at all. Okay, they're not religiously opposed to interest. They're intellectually opposed to interest because they see what it's doing to society. So they said they made this organization and they came up with this idea and they made this bank and they've been operating it and now they've been very successful, and there's a perfect model that Muslims can learn from. So basically it's, look, if non-Muslims can do it, and if they're smart enough to understand interest is bad for our economy, and they're able to make it sustainable since 1965 or even older than that, right? And they had 39,000 members. The idea that, oh, well, we're going to get ripped off and this and that, it's a problem. 1997, Swedish government comes and says, you have to get a banking license now. You can't be a non-profit organization. They said, okay, we'll get a banking license. Now, the government of Sweden insures the deposits in JAK Bank, even though it's an interest-free bank. So you see how things have changed. They've shifted, right? So when you have some shift in government or shift in policy, this is feasible, right? So it's very, very doable. So this could potentially be a good role model for us to get out of this interest problem that we have.
Just to respond to that, and this will be the last point, and we'll end with this, inshallah, is fine, there's one bank in Sweden that you use as an example, great, but like that model doesn't scale, right? So if the other banks don't want to do that, they don't have the systems, if the banks fall apart, the economies are going to fall apart. We can't run the planet's economic system on this. It's just one little bank. So what response do you have for that?
Okay. So you're absolutely right. This is not the solution. This is not going to work. We can't sit here and wait for this, all right? Even though some of us locally, we tried to start something like this, it did not work, right? If you've ever been involved in a nonprofit project, you know that it's much more challenging than it sounds. So yeah, this is not going to be the solution. But instead, what the actual solution is going to be converting an entire economy to an interest-free economy. Now, how do you do that, right? How can you possibly convert an entire economy to an interest-free economy? Well, it's actually not as difficult as it sounds. The reason why is because non-Muslim economists have already laid out the entire foundation. Many economists are making the argument and saying, we need to remove interest from our economy and go back to the way it was, because this is not a healthy model. So many people have made the argument, and they've mapped out the entire thing and said, this is how we can go back to a completely interest-free economy step by step. So they said, how are you going to do it? Step number one, okay, is that banks are not going to become goodwill nonprofit institutions like JAK Bank. That is not the solution. Maybe it's a good idea to have like on the side, right? It would be nice to see that, but that's not a solution. That's a solution for like me to buy a car, or you to buy, something, fund your children's wedding, when they come up or something like that. Not for not on a macro level. So number one, banks will not become goodwill institutions. This is a common misconception people have. We're going to go interest-free economy. All banks are going to give loans now with no interest. And they're not going to make any money. So they're all going to shut down and we're finished. No. They're going to switch to a PLS model, which is a profit and loss sharing model. So if you take a bank and you think what a bank does, bank, people put their deposits inside the bank. That bank goes and loans money out on interest into other businesses, and those businesses go and try to make money, and then they return interest back. What are you eliminating? You're just eliminating only the interest part. The depositors still put their money in the bank. The bank is still going to not loan money on interest anymore. They're going to invest money on a profit and loss sharing basis with the businesses and the institutions that they think will be making some profit. So that one that now that makes 200% profit, guess what? Profit and loss sharing. The bank makes it, which means the depositors make that money. So you get that money coming back in. That all of those banks can turn into these investment type banks, which are going to be converted. So profit and loss sharing, number one. Number two, what's going to happen as soon as that takes place? Every single bank in the entire system gets converted over. Let's just take one country. Take a little small country. What's the smallest country out there? Sealand? Is that a real country? Not Sea World, right? So, Sealand. Okay, let's take Sealand, right? Sealand, all of a sudden, they're like, we're on board. We're ready to go. Convert all their banks, if they have more than one, right? Convert all of their banks into profit and loss sharing. The first thing that's going to happen is when a recession comes, when deflation is going to take place, there's going to be less default. There's going to be less bankruptcy. The economy is going to become much more stable, right? So someone is going to come along and say, well, you know what? You need this on a much larger level. You know, Sealand, you know, has to be dealing with a bunch of other countries and stuff. This is not large enough. Well, right, you know how big the Islamic banking industry is right now? Just the Islamic banking industry only? $4 trillion. Okay? $4 trillion industry. At the moment, right now, that's just the way that it functions. Right? So what's going to happen, there's a problem. The problem is government, like what happened with Finland, the government's going to throw a bunch of roadblocks in the way. They'll be like, no, you're not allowed to do this, you're not allowed to do this. Yeah, that is a problem, right? But once the industry keeps growing, once it's hitting $4 trillion, you have some political clout now, and you're like, no, people want this, and when people want it, now you can't keep throwing the regulations in there, right? Little JAK Bank, you know, maybe you could have stopped them in the 30s, but you're not going to be able to stop a $4 trillion industry when people are getting together. So that's one response there. The economists have the plan. So they're saying, you know what? Okay, first step is we're going to, one, change the banks, profit and loss sharing. The first step is convert all debt into equity. So when you convert all debt, equity meaning like some actual asset. So when you convert debt into an equity, what's going to happen? Banking system is not going to collapse. It's going to be stable. There's not going to have cycles anymore. Bank runs, the idea of a bank run is basically all those people, like the goldsmith example I gave you, all the people come and they're like, I want my gold. And they're like, oh, we overloaned it. It's not there, right? Everyone comes and tries to take their bank money from the bank at the same time. Bank runs are very unlikely to happen. Why? Because nobody gets scared that a bank is losing all its money. Because every dollar or every type of money that the bank has is tied to some real asset that actually has value. It's not just in thin air. It's just a number in a book, right? So that's what's going to happen. Then you're going to have long-term depositors, right? If you wanted to keep your money in the bank for a long period of time and just leave it there, you have to pay for storage now. You're not getting interest rate back. So if you're going to have to pay for storage, what's going to happen? You're like, no, I want to see this invested from the bank. So what's going to happen? More money is going to be moving to the marketplace, from the marketplace coming back in. So there's going to be a lot more real economic activity, not the derivatives 95%, speculative economic activity that exists. Money will start to stabilize immediately. It's going to become a real unit of measurement that's valid, tells you some real, stable value that has some benefit. Long-term investments now are going to become more viable. So business will start to flourish more. And countries, people are going to be freed from all the burdens of debt. Right? So this is the immediate effects of just doing that one thing. You convert debt into equity, and all those things are going to follow, right? And this idea of necessity that Umar is coming with, people are going to say, what, you're going to do all of that? How long is that going to take? It will take some time. So you can use the doctrine of necessity in the transitionary period and say, okay, you know what? You got these giant government loans. they need to be converted into some project-related, project-based financing. You have asset-related loans. They need to be converted into maybe leases or something like that. It doesn't matter. You say, well, who's going to accept this? Non-Muslim countries will not accept it. See, look, as long as lenders who originally gave a loan, as long as they get some money back, right? As long as they get their interest, whether it's interest or it's actual profit from a project that made money, as long as they're getting their money, they're fine. The only part they're not going to be fine with is that they're not going to be able to take over your economy anymore and control you. They're not going to be able to keep you in debt, right? And control you in that way and keep on getting, increase, and you keep on paying off the debt. But they will get their profits and the percentage that they had originally intended for. So people are not losing out. You will not be wrong. You will not wrong, and you will not be wronged, right? That's exactly what's happening. So this is the way forward, and this is the potential solution on a macro level. Okay?
Just want to present a couple of analogies in case people are curious. So this isn't the first time humanity's realized we've done something wrong, we need to fix it. So same thing's happening with fossil fuels right now. We realized that we shouldn't have put so much investment in fossil fuels, and now we're killing our planet. And so now there's massive movements to go green and clean and protect our environment, right? Not that everyone in the world is on board, but there's a large effort, people getting solar panels and wind energy and all of this effort going on because the planet has decided to come together, except for Trump, and come together in Paris and agree to a set of things to make the world better for our generations to come. Same thing's going on with food. We realize that the hormones that we keep putting into our animals and the GMO that we keep doing is not great for us, right? So there's a movement towards eating clean, eating healthy, eating organic, right? We want to get organic food if we can afford it. So people are trying to improve that. Same thing here is this isn't just an Islamic problem. And one of the things I'll talk about next weekend is Islamic finance equals ethical finance. We aren't the only ones who are worried about this, right? Every religion prohibited it for a reason. These intellectuals who don't even follow religion prohibited it for a reason. Those reasons are affecting our economy, the number of fatwa questions. So Shaykh Mustafa and I are both doing our ifta, studies in how to become a mufti. The number of questions we get related to non-Muslim organizations that are offering halal financial products is very high. There's so many organizations now that are doing interest-free loans, interest-free like house mortgages, things like that. Have nothing to do with Muslims. Muslims are just one of the markets, but they're just going, we want ethical finance. So this is very doable. But anyway, today we spent a lot of time deconstructing, talking about the badness of riba and what was wrong and all of these things. But we didn't spend as much time, very little time talking about construction. Like, okay, so what do we do? What if I want to buy a house? What mechanism does Islam provide for that? And how would that work, both from a theoretical standpoint and from a practical standpoint? What if I want to get into a business? Can I still give someone money to invest or not? Like, what can I do? So next weekend, inshallah, we'll get into how do you invest in stocks? How do you form partnerships in business? How do you buy a house? These kinds of things, theoretically and practice, inshallah. That will be the objective. Maybe, do you want to take 4 minutes of questions? And then, Zohar? 10 minutes of questions? Okay. We'll do 10 minutes of questions, inshallah.
So what we're going to do is we're going to take one question from online and one question from the chair here. So if everyone wants to ask a question, just line up behind this chair in the middle, and you're going to sit down on the chair, grab the microphone, talk into the microphone, so we can record your voice that you're asking the question, inshallah ta'ala. Okay. Yeah. Okay, we'll answer that first. Go ahead.
The question is, how do you convert debt into equity? So the answer is you are effectively replacing one contract with another contract, right? So if somebody already has an interest-based loan, if somebody already has an let's say a country has an interest-based loan, you can't just say, well, don't pay it back, right? So even Islam, when this verse came about in Surah Baqarah, what it said was, you can take your principal back, but don't take any interest on it, right? But obviously, like, that's not a great answer for the person who loaned the money expecting some profit from it. Because for most people in the world, interest and profit mean the same thing. So the idea would be that if this is a gradual transition. So number one, any new transactions, any new contracts you get into, you would do them as equity. That part's easy and clear, right? You would not get into any new debt-based instruments. So that would be the first part. Second part is gradually, not to disrupt the world economy, but gradually what you would do is start getting regulations in place. Just like there's regulations on everything, right? On interest rates and usury and all this stuff. You would start getting, if this is something a government decides, is we want to have a well-functioning, efficient economy. By the way, when we speak about this, we're not just speaking from an Islamic standpoint. Just go read like Adam Smith or any of these other economists and the concept of efficient markets and how they're supposed to operate. If you want to have a good market economy, the government's going to decide we're going to, over time, implement some regulations. Those regulations would slowly start changing the nature of contracts. And so as those come about, you might say, hey, we're going to take a certain number of contracts and flip them from, it won't just be interest, it'll be a profit share model. So you'd have to do that over time. Most of the transition would happen through new financing. No, that's just not reality. It's not practical. Yeah.
Online question is, interest is mostly an issue when dealing with buying a house, at least in my immediate family. Can you touch on the different options for buying a house? So what we're going to do is we're going to mention that next week. So we're going to talk about the different options that are presented and how those options are really supposed to work in order for them to properly avoid riba. And we'll comment a little bit about to what extent are they actually working, okay? Next question, I'll just do online real quick. What is you want to add to that?
Yeah, one of the things that we will compare is a conventional interest-based house loan to an Islamic mechanism for buying a house. In case like you're like, okay, I get it, like these economies have been like suffering, people are getting poor, all this stuff. I want to know about me. Like, why is it bad if I personally get a loan from a conventional bank? That will become very clear, inshallah, when we go through that example, so you can understand at a personal level what's going on when you get a conventional loan versus when you get an Islamic mechanism for the financing. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I was going to answer the second one here too. What is the solution to this major problem of interest? That's the entire, second week. Inshallah, that's the solution. So I gave you the micro solution. And I gave you this, kind of how it's going to work, but we're going to break it down in more detail, inshallah ta'ala. Go ahead. Just turn it on. Go ahead. Yeah.
What is the meaning of the word zaru? Quranic Arabic.
Zaru means give up.
Does it mean stay away or give up? Just look at the word in the context of the entire ayah. وَذَرُوا مَا بَقِيَ مِنَ الرِّبَى. So, give up whatever remains of the interest. So, what you're saying is, it's the first verse is talking about, it starts with like, الَّذِينَ يَأْكُلُونَ الرِّبَى. Very general, people who take riba. When we get to this point, what it's saying is, وَذَرُوا مَا بَقِيَ مِنَ الرِّبَى. What it's saying is, give up anything that remains. So, at that time, the Muslims were instructed, because the Muslims were actually giving out loans as well on riba, some of them, right? Were instructed, do not take interest, any remaining interest on an existing contract. مَا بَقِيَ, whatever remains. Anything that remains. What will remain? The only thing that will remain is on an existing contract, right? I have a contract with you, you owe me interest. Even though we have an agreement and you owe it to me, I'm told I cannot take that interest anymore. So that prohibition says, give that up, which is different than what I was talking about for proposing to the macro economy. Let me explain why there's a difference. As Muslims, we can say a new command has come, or a new command that I've learned about that says give up interest. Allah says give up interest, okay, I give up interest, right? I can't go to a non-Muslim and say, give up interest. I can convince them why that's rationally good, but I can't convince them that they have an existing contract, they should give up riba on that, right? So the solution to converting the world today, the macro economy, the world's economies, to give up interest would be to say, let's stop that with new contracts. You can try and convince them to do it existing contracts, and you can try and convert them to equity, but the contract is already there. By the way, if you've already signed a contract, let me ask this question. If one of you, or let's say I sign a contract, I signed it a year ago, that says I need to pay interest. I found out in today's seminar, because Shaykh Mustafa convinced me, that I really shouldn't pay interest on it. What do I do? Do I pay the interest or not pay the interest? Try to tell them it's forbidden. It's not going to work, right? Yes, you can try. You should try and tell them it's forbidden, but it's not going to work. So if you have signed a contract, right? If one of us has signed a contract that says we will pay interest, whether it's a student loan, a credit card, whatever it is, that we owe, we must pay that interest because we signed the contract, we committed to it, right? As soon as possible. We must do that. So we have to honor our contracts. The Quran says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu awfu bil uqud, right? We have to honor the contracts that we've signed. Even if the contract has this haram element of interest, we must honor it and get rid of it as soon as possible that we can, right? So we're not going to go convince someone else. It's very hard to convince someone else that they shouldn't take interest, but once you explain the rationale, new contracts can be done that way, if that makes sense. But what if we find out and we're taking interest, we must immediately stop taking the interest.
Next question is in response to the Ghazali quote, what if the lender is actually using the interest it's collecting for real economic activities, especially for social good, right? So I would say the same thing. What if a loan shark is building a masjid and giving money to the poor with everything that they're doing, right? What if a drug dealer is selling heroin, but he's actually going and giving it to this impoverished neighborhood and he's building wells in Africa with that money, that he's making, right? It doesn't matter. The transaction is still problematic, right? So that's generally not what normally ends up happening. But yeah, there are people who can do that, right? So it doesn't change the nature of the contract. It doesn't change the morality of the contract itself. If they're doing that, that's great, but it doesn't change that.
No, if they're doing that, it's not great. just to correct Shaykh Mustafa, if they're doing it, it's not great. What they're doing, the good they're doing is great, but if they're using means from riba to do it, then it is not great. It doesn't, the end does not, in Islam, the end does not justify the means, okay? We might have heard that expression in regular speak. The end justify the means. No. In Islam, the end do not justify the means. The means themselves have to be correct. We can't say in the end we got to a good place. Let's call it the Robin Hood concept. Islam does not have a concept of Robin Hood. You cannot take money from the rich and give it to the poor and say, I'm doing a good thing. You're not doing a good thing. Isn't giving money to the poor a good thing? Not if you're stealing that money from the rich. It is not justified. The end do not justify the means. Remember that.
Just come to the microphone. While you're coming, I'll answer the next one. Those in favor of interest theory argue that I worked really hard to earn my money, and now I'm putting it to work for me. So what does Islam say? Well, Islam says, yes, if you worked hard to earn your money, then you should put it to work for you by investing it on a profit and loss basis, right? This is, again, Islam is not telling you that all your money now should just be used in goodwill loans to everyone else and you don't make a profit off of it. That's not what Islam is saying. Islam is saying use your money to make some more money through investment, through sale, through trade, but not through riba. And if you say, well, trade is like riba, that's exactly what the Quran addressed. It says, no, it's not. It says, one of them is halal, one of them is haram, and there's a big difference between the two of them. Okay? So that's what Islam is saying. Go ahead.
Going back to my question about having a bank account, is it become as a necessity nowadays that you should have a bank account and them using your money in interest, you don't?
It depends on the type of bank account that you're talking about. So fundamentally, the contract that you sign with the bank for a checking account, and now we have to specify, a non-interest bearing checking account, because actually you can get checking accounts with interest on them nowadays. They're sometimes called preferred checking accounts, but sometimes they're just called checking accounts. To get a non-interest bearing checking account from a bank, the contract that you sign with the bank, right, when you get a checking account, does that have any interest on it? It doesn't have any interest on it, so what's wrong with it? They use your money. When you buy, let's say, tomatoes from Smart and Final, and the money goes to, or let's say you buy money from, let's make it simple. You buy a product, whatever it is, vegetables, fruit, car, from a Christian person, or let's call it an atheist person, right? They use that money in the back end, and they drink alcohol, or they use it for prostitution or gambling or something else. Are you responsible for that? You're not responsible for that. So what the bank is using the money for, that's like not our concern. Our contract with them is a checking account, a service account. That's a checking account. Yes, we know they're using it for haram, and we don't like that, and we speak out against it. But our contract with them is a halal contract. Islam does not prohibit you from doing business with a person just because that person is using that money unwisely or in what we consider a sinful way. Islam does not prohibit those types of. The Prophet ﷺ did business with the Jews, right? Does everybody know that? He did business with the Jews, right? Did he know that the Jews were then using that money in the back end and dealing with interest? Of course he knew that. But he still did business with them. He didn't say, I'm not going to do business with you because I know what you're doing with the money, right? And those transactions weren't always like on-the-spot transactions, right? There were transactions where many transactions you're like, let me give you the product now and get the money later, that kind of thing, right? So he didn't stop doing contracts with non-Muslims just because they were using it in some poor way, if that makes sense.
So in addition to that, I mean, what's going to happen is, let's say you have $100,000 and you put it in your free checking account, at Chase, and they give you no interest. So one of the first things they're going to do is the manager is going to approach you and be like, hey, sir, you have $100,000 in your free checking account, and if we would like to help you, transfer that into a different account where we're going to give you all these rewards. We're going to give you, here's a little, sticker for you, and here's we're going to let you get free cashier's checks, and we'll give you a little temporary tattoo. They're going to give you like a bunch of gifts. Here's a gift basket. Here's a chocolate bar. Just somehow transfer this into the other one. We can take care of it for you, right? They're going to try to convince you to do that. And they go, and you can earn interest on it, right? So the average Muslim is thinking between two ways. And someone asked me this during break. Ironically, it was my dad. So, all right, so he's like, you better address this issue too. I'm like, yeah, Dad, I will. So I'm addressing it now, even though he left. All right, so what happens is, if you change and you say, well, you know what, it's the same thing. Your money's sitting in the bank anyways. What's the difference between it being in this account or this account or this account? Right? Because if you ask them, well, I don't want the interest in this account, you can put in this, I want the benefits, but I don't want the interest. One, they're going to say you're crazy, right? Because they don't understand. But two, they're like, sir, there's no other way to override it. You have no choice but to take the interest, right? You could gift it back to me, at the end of the period, but you have to be accrued interest on it. So the question is, why do you get those benefits? Should you take those benefits? If your money's in the bank, it's the same thing. This account, this account, this account, someone will say, it doesn't make any difference. Well, just think for a moment. It makes a huge difference. Why do they care to transfer your money from one account to another account? There's a reason. What do you think the reason is? What's the difference for them? They're going to use it differently, right? And when they're going to use it differently, they're going to use it for their purpose, and their purpose is to make money off of money, which is interest. So what you're doing is, by transferring it from the absolute bare minimum account that you should have had it in, to get that little gift basket, you ended up fueling the system even more. And our goal is not to fuel the system more, right? So even if you could say, well, I can do this, and I've heard this from many people, I can just put it in here, and I can take all the interest, and I can donate the interest to the masjid. I don't want it. It's just going to go to the masjid. You say, oh, you shouldn't go to the masjid because only masjid should have clean money? So there's some fatwa somebody gave. It goes to the bathrooms of the masjid. You know? I said, you know what? I said, you know, it's very tempting because the bathrooms of most masjids definitely need improvement, you know, and I get that part, totally understandable. But at the same time, just think about the concept. What are you doing, right? Where is this? What is happening with your money when you make that transfer? Now you're fueling the system more. I said, no, we can use it for electricity, right? You're not going to even, you know, utilize it for yourself. So the problem is, the concept is that we are trying to use a bank as a store of money. And the bank is trying to use your money as a way to loan out that money. So if you have to engage in it, you should engage in it at the absolute bare minimum. And this was a fatwa given a long time ago by a scholar when he was visiting Canada. His name was Shaykh Abdul Fattah Abu Ghudda. He was asked the same question. And he says, do it to the absolute minimum extent and try to take absolutely no interest from it whatsoever, or the absolute minimum possible interest that you can, because you're trying to use it as a store of value, but they're trying to do it as something else. And that's the way the issue should be viewed, inshallah. Yeah, so we'll finish here, and we'll take private questions afterwards. So we'll give you, inshallah, a few minutes to make wudu, and then we'll pray Zohar here. And did anyone not register yet for the seminar? Not registered? Okay, if you have not registered, and you plan on coming, just go on calislamic.com/events and just register. Okay, please. Jazakumullah khair.
Yeah, and inshallah, we will try and leave a lot more time for Q&A, especially because next week we're going to spend time on a lot of the practical things. So I'm sure people will have a lot more questions. As the theory starts to become more practice, then we'll try and save we'll try to do at least like an hour for Q&A if we can, inshallah, because there'll probably be a lot more questions. With that, we're going to finish. Go ahead.
All right, so we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to free us from the burden of debt, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us to remove interest from our own personal lives and to help and contribute to removing interest from society at large. Ameen. Subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik. Nastaghfirukallah wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.